Hello, everyone. We're going to get started in a minute here. Our first session is going to be a welcome and introduction. I'm Eric Crawford. I'm pleased to do the welcome and introduction to the 50th anniversary celebration of the Food Security Group. I'd like to welcome all of you who have joined. We're very happy that you've been able to do that, and we're looking forward to interacting with you during the rest of the afternoon. We really wish we could have gathered together in person, but failing that, we hope that you can participate with us online without technical issues. We welcome comments or questions during any part of this program. We'd like to ask you to please use the Zoom Q&A feature for that. The chat feature will be disabled. And please also note that this event is being recorded and will be made available to you later. I'd like to introduce myself briefly. First, I'm a recently retired AFRI professor and a former co-director of the Food Security Group. I joined the department in 1979 with an appointment in international ag development. And I've worked closely with what we are now calling the Food Security Group since then, which covers 45 out of the 50 years of the Food Security Group's existence. So first of all, by way of an overview, again, we're glad that you could join us to do two things. One, to celebrate 50 years of activity of our Food Security Group, or FSG, and also for joining us in discussions on future FSG priorities and key success factors, the way in which we can ensure future success of our programs. My remarks, or these brief remarks, will cover what is the Food Security Group, what do we mean by that? Second, what are our goals for this event? And then I'll be introducing the speakers and panel leaders that will take over from there. Okay, what is FSG? Well, we think of the Food Security Group as a self-organized team within AFRI, largely grant-funded, a team that carries out empirically based, policy-oriented scholarly research, engagement, and capacity building focused on problems of global food security. The mission of FSG is listed here. FSG believes that good food and nutrition policy, informed by solid empirical evidence that's generated jointly with local partners, can transform economies and lives in low-income countries. Further, I'd like to note that many AFRI faculty have participated in international activities, some through the Food Security Group's managed programs. For more information on all AFRI faculty international activities since the 1930s, I'd direct you to look at a recent publication called Historical Milestones of AFRI International Involvement, 1933 to 2023. This document was originally drafted by the late Mike Weber, our great colleague, in 2015, and I've worked with John Statz and others to update and extend this. If you look at the document, you'll see that Derek Byerlee made some valuable contributions to this as well. The document's now available on AgEcon Search, which you probably know how to contact, but the link to that is given here. Okay, so why are we doing this Food Security Group anniversary session? Well, first of all, it's part of the department's 75th year celebrations, which will happen tomorrow. Secondly, we want to recognize FSG's 50 years of activities, and we're counting that starting from the mid-1970s, when Carl Eicher's long-term grant-funded projects pioneered what became known as the Food Security Group. He worked with colleagues in the department and in the Department of Economics to get major grant-funded projects going to do applied research and capacity development primarily in Africa. We also want to engage your thoughts with ours on looking ahead. What should be future FSG focus areas? What's needed for continued success in research and policy impact? How can we achieve these impacts? And in thinking about these questions, we believe that a major key for success is to build partnerships with country and regional institutions to ensure resource sharing, joint resource participation, and stronger local policy capacity, as well as impacts on policy through greater ownership and credibility of the results of the research. Our speakers this afternoon, to explore future opportunities for FSG, we've invited 3 distinguished speakers and have convened 2 panels of discussants. Bios for the 3 main speakers, Matin Qaim, Derek Byerlee, and Jeffrey Bloem, have been shared, but I'll now briefly highlight their profiles and also those of the 2 panel leaders. Matin Qaim, the keynote speaker, is Schlegel Professor of Agricultural Economics and Director at the Center for Development Research of the University of Bonn in Germany. His main research areas are sustainable food systems, poverty reduction, and rural development, which we think match those of FSG very closely. He's also a fellow of the American Agricultural and Applied Economics Association and president of the International Association of Agricultural Economists. Complementary remarks will be made by Derek Byerlee and Jeffrey Bloem. Derek Byerlee began his post-PhD academic career in MSU's Department of Agricultural Economics as an assistant and associate professor from 1971 to 78, during which time FSG was first being formed. His later career included assignments in the CIMMYT economics program and at the World Bank, among others, and recognition as an AAEA fellow. Jeffrey Bloem earned his MS degree in our department and also a PhD in applied economics from the University of Minnesota. He's currently research fellow at IFPRI in the Markets, Trade, and Institutions Unit, and is also affiliated with development-oriented programs at Notre Dame and American University. We've convened 2 panels to provide further comments and discussion on research and on partnering and collaboration. And the 2 discussion panel leaders are shown here. First, Dr. Liverpool-Tasie came to AFRI. Saweda Liverpool-Tasie came to AFRI in 2012 with a PhD from the University of Illinois. She soon established an award-winning research and teaching program. She's currently MSU Foundation Professor in AFRI and Director of a major project in Nigeria and Tanzania on research supporting African micro, small, and medium enterprises to provide safe and nutritious food. This is among other projects that she directs. She's also a BIFAD board member. Dr. Tschirley is an AFRI PhD graduate and a longtime faculty member. He has extensive field experience in Africa and Latin America. He's professor and co-director of the Food Security Group and director of the flagship USAID-funded Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Food Security Policy Research, Capacity, and Influence. Dave also received MSU's Ralph Smuckler Award for advancing international studies and programs. So with that introduction, I'm going to pass the virtual microphone to Dr. Qaim. Welcome and many thanks for joining us. When you finish your remarks, I'll pass the virtual microphone to the next speaker, Derek Byerlee, and I will now stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Eric. And I assume that you can now see my full screen. So first of all, thanks for the introduction. And I want to start with congratulations for the Food Security Group on 50 years of excellent research. There's so much tremendously good work coming out of your group that you can be proud of. And I thank you for inviting me to this keynote. And I'm proud to be part of this event here. So let me just see how I can get all the other pictures. You can hear me well, right?
Yes, we can hear you fine, Martin.
Okay, I just have too many pictures. So now I'm set. So Let me start by telling you that obviously talking about the future of food security research or policy impact is a challenge, and I try to give you some insights from my perspective, but those will be subjective, and this is what I'm trying to do. I'll start with an overview of the food security situations, how it looks like today. How trends may look like, bring in the issue of planetary health, sustainability challenges, and combined, they will soon lead us to the conclusion that we need a food system transformation. The question, what exactly that means, is one that we want to discuss. I'll talk about some research priorities from my subjective perspective, and will stop my or conclude my remarks with a more general statement on how I see the role of our agricultural economics profession in the changing food systems landscape. So let me start by looking at food security. I mean, obviously, you're an expert audience, and I don't need to tell you that we haven't achieved a world without hunger yet. The latest numbers by FAO are telling us that more than 700 million people are still suffering from hunger in an energy sense, so not having sufficient access to calories. Most of these people living in Asia and Africa. But when we're constantly hearing those large numbers, we sometimes forget that quite some progress has been made. We're looking today at below 10% of the world population that's suffering from hunger. And when we look only a few decades back, then this was much, much higher, 50% and more. We basically never had a time in human history where the share of the world population that had access to sufficient calories was larger than it is now. And I think that progress needs to be stressed, because otherwise we're getting too pessimistic. Nothing can be done. We are not achieving our goals, and therefore we should be sad. That's not the case. Progress has been made, but obviously we can also not close our eyes of the fact that progress has been slowed and reversed, and we are now, for the last couple of years, since 2015, actually looking at a situation where the numbers are not going down, rather going up. We can also not close our eyes of the fact that hunger is only one form of malnutrition. We have micronutrient malnutrition, which we often call hidden hunger, where we don't know the exact number of people affected, but it's somewhere between 2 and 3 billion people, so larger than the number of energy deficient people. And we have this third form of malnutrition, overweight and obesity, leading to lots of different chronic diseases. And this is also a global phenomenon, not only one of the rich world. So we're talking about the triple burden of malnutrition. And when we're looking at how serious these are in terms of health implications, we have the global burden of disease data that are telling us how things evolved since 1990. And we're seeing that, yes, the burden of the health burden related to hunger has come down, but is still relatively high. Micronutrient deficiency burden is as high and hasn't come down as fast, and the burden of overweight and obesity is increasing and is by now actually already higher than the burden of the other two malnutrition problems. So the nature of the problem is changing. It's still there, but the changing nature also means that strategies to fight malnutrition and to strive towards food and nutrition security certainly need some adjustment. The basic question we should be asking is, why is this so? Why are so many people malnourished? And the very direct and simple answer is, a big reason is that many people, more than 1/3 of the world population, simply cannot afford a healthy diet. Now, this is work that Will Masters, who is also part of the event today, has put a lot of effort in. Very important work, affordability of diets. affordability obviously is a question of income and prices, and as simple as it is, but we need to be concerned about income of poor people and prices of food in general and healthy food in particular. Now, does that mean if the income rises and the prices are affordable that all malnutrition will be gone? Unfortunately not. We see that in those parts of the world where affordability is not a big issue, we don't have necessarily healthy nutrition, but obviously the income and price and affordability question is a necessary condition, if not a sufficient condition. But we're looking currently at a situation where we have increasing frequencies of income and price shocks, and these are rather aggravating the situation. And I think it's worthwhile to look at prices of food for a minute. Here we are seeing the longer term price trend for wheat, one of the most important staple foods. And when we are looking at prices today, then we are seeing they're much lower than they were 2 years ago. And therefore, today, nobody is talking about high prices. But when you're looking at the different spikes here, these are spikes that are obviously making life harder for poor people to afford diets and healthy diets. And when we're looking at the long-term trend, then we're seeing actually prices today are not so low. We're actually seeing rather increasing price trends, and that's quite different from the trends that we saw last century, where prices only knew one trend, and that was falling. So things are different, and we shouldn't only look at the short-term price shocks, but also keep the longer-term supply and demand factors in sight. And one of the reasons why we're not seeing falling prices, but rather increasing prices is the fact that we're not producing or not seeing as much production growth today as we saw in previous decades. You're seeing here that in the last decades, production growth was lower. And we see not only production growth, but yield growth was actually significantly lower than in previous decades. And that means that more land expansion is being seen. So both things are obviously not good, that we're producing less and that we're producing partly more through expanding the land area simply because the yields aren't high enough, or the yield growth isn't high enough. That's something we need to keep in mind. Now, obviously, so far we've talked about the human health dimension, food security, but we're having the environmental health dimension as well. We have resource scarcities, the old Malthusian arguments that are still valid today. We have a situation where farming is responsible for major environmental problems. An estimated 80% of the global biodiversity loss is due to agriculture. About 1/3 of the global greenhouse gas emissions are from agriculture and the food system. Even if we were able overnight to get out of the burning of fossil fuels, the food system greenhouse gas emissions alone would suffice to thwart the Paris climate targets. And that's clearly telling us that all sectors, including food and agriculture, obviously cannot continue as they did in the past, but change is needed. Climate change and other environmental problems for agriculture are not just an abstract problem, but obviously problem that are directly affecting productivity. This is a map that some of you may know from a paper from Ariel Ortiz-Bobea a few years back. This is showing not predictions of yield by 2050 or so. This is showing the estimated effects that climate change already had since the 1960s until 2010. And it's showing that climate change is already real in terms of reducing agriculture productivity. And that's very unequal across the different parts of the world, with those countries along the equator being most affected, and Africa here in dark red. I'll come back to that a little bit later. But I think it becomes clear that we need obviously major changes, and this is what many people call the food system transformation. And I think there's probably global consensus about transformation that is needed. What the consensus is a little bit less clear is what exactly that means. What do we mean? What are the changes that we need, and how are future, or how should future food systems actually going to look like? Well, food systems need to become more sustainable, and that means ensuring food and nutrition security for all without overstraining the environment. And that indeed requires many changes in terms of how food is produced, distributed, and consumed. But not sure about the US debate, but in Europe, many who are contributing to the debate often imply that we need to reverse everything, a change by 180 degrees. And I don't agree with that. Obviously not. I mean, many things that were done in the past were right. There were a few problems, but rather than talking everything bad, we need to learn from past successes, and we need to learn from past problems and move forward smartly. All countries need to act. That means that for food security, it's not only mattering what's happening in Africa or Asia, it's also mattering what's happening in Europe or North America. But the priorities and the best leverage points are not necessarily the same everywhere. So there's no blueprint that works globally. We need to identify local solutions and keep in mind the synergies and trade-off of the action. I want to come to a few research priorities from my subjective perspective, and subjective also because these are topics that I'm currently working on and that I find not only important but also interesting. And on all of these 4 points, A, B, C, D, I want to spend 1 or 2 slides in order to tell you what I mean with that. Let's start with sustainable productivity growth. Well, in Europe, we are at a situation where people are terribly concerned about the environment, and rightly so, but not seeing that yields also matter at the same time. And that is coming out of a notion or ignoring the fact, probably not knowing the historical background, that yield growth was one of the key drivers of hunger reduction that we saw over the last couple of decades. The right-hand graph here is one that I showed earlier. The left-hand graph is showing cereal yield developments in different parts of the world. And it's not a matter of coincidence that yield growth is correlated with a reduction in hunger. There are now very well-researched studies with solid data that are showing there's a causal link, and that the yield growth, productivity growth in agriculture has been the #1 factor for food security improvements over the last decades. And therefore, we can also not be surprised to see that food insecurity today is largest in that region that saw the lowest yield and productivity increases in agriculture, namely sub-Saharan Africa. So yes, productivity growth in Africa remains a challenge, but productivity growth in other regions is as important. And we need to stress the fact that yield growth is not only important from a food security perspective, but is also needed to reduce agricultural area expansion, deforestation. We already saw on one of the previous slides, when yield growth is going down, the area expansion increases, and that's obviously not good for greenhouse gas emissions and biodiversity. So what are some of the research questions that we as agricultural economists need to look into in order to make sure that there can be sustainable productivity growth? It's not necessarily more of exactly the same type of inputs and technologies that have been used in the past. Of course, we need smarter technologies, digital technologies, new breeding technologies, improvements in agronomy, maybe even things that lead us away from our traditional definition of farming, novel foods, precision fermentation. All of these things are needed, have potential, and we need to make sure that they're developed in a way that's fair, that's equitable, and that poor people also can benefit from. And that's not necessarily something that's a given. Well, we need to look into systems in terms of systems diversity. Obviously, we need to look into access questions, infrastructure, institutions. These are some of the old questions that are still very relevant. Ensure gender equity and ask the question, how are we going to mobilize funding? I mean, with current public funding, priorities, at least in the European context, I'm not seeing that funding for agriculture and food security that is so importantly needed is going to go up much when it needs to. But maybe private sector funding can become more relevant and important. Climate change. I mean, I've mentioned already how important that factor is. This is a graph that I showed you, and this is a graph that I showed you, the one on affordability of diets, the other one on productivity effects through climate change. And unfortunately, we're seeing that overlap in terms of, Africa and some of the other poorer regions of this world where affordability is already low and will become less because climate change is going to lead to declining yields and rising food prices and lower affordability. So we need to be concerned. And even though we know that, I don't really feel that we are acting sufficiently, both from a policy and a research perspective. Let me show you a few of the important links that conceptually we understand, but we don't know exactly empirically how they're playing out in different situations. So there's climate change and there's nutrition outcomes, and the arrow pointing downwards means that we have to expect that nutrition outcomes are going to be worse. Some of the links are through the food systems, through agriculture, where yields are going down, food losses also post-harvest are likely going to increase through climate change, micronutrient contents of foods that are going to be lower. And all of these through different mechanisms are going to reduce diet quality and are already doing so today, and nutrition outcomes. But there are other mechanisms that may be less obvious, perhaps. I mean, there are mechanisms through workloads, and this is particularly relevant for female workloads. There are mechanisms through direct effects of climate change on human health that is also potentially increasing infectious diseases, nutrient retention, and having direct and indirect negative effects on food security and nutrition outcomes. We need to get a better understanding of some of these mechanisms and how relevant they are in particular contexts, and connected to that, obviously then also come up with suggestions and concrete interventions to improve the resilience and adaptation of all households, but smallholder farming households in particular. Yes, this involves technology, this involves institutions and social safety nets. Let me say a few words on the last bullet point here, better rural employment opportunities. These are relevant anyway. We need them, but they're particularly relevant also from a climate change perspective. This is insights from a recent paper we published in the European Review of Agricultural Economics. On the one hand, clearly showing that drought episodes that are going to increase in frequency are reducing yield. They're reducing farm employment and income and food expenditures. This is not so surprising. The novelty of this paper is that we're looking more deeply into the labor reallocation effects, and we're seeing that households are trying to reallocate labor to off-farm activities. They're successfully doing that partly to self-employment. They're not mostly successfully doing that to wage employment simply because they're lacking employment opportunities in those rural areas. So we're showing that the off-farm self-employment helps to mitigate negative food security effects, but obviously we need much more employment in non-agricultural sectors in rural areas in order to have not only income generation opportunities, but also risk mitigation strategies for poor agriculture-dependent households. A few words on healthy and sustainable diets. I mean, when we're using that term, most of us are probably immediately thinking of the Eat Lancet planetary health diet that I probably don't need to explain much. But however we are thinking about the Eat Lancet planetary health diet, whether we like it, whether we think it's a great approach, whether we have a lot of criticism with the approach, in my eyes, it's the beginning of a research field. It's not the end of a research field, but it's a beginning of the research field where we need to see that, yes, healthy and sustainable diets require a human health perspective. They require an environmental health perspective. And this is what Eat Lancet has done. But they also require a perspective on the socioeconomic conditions, all those questions: at what prices, what are incentives, what are policies, what are the right steps into the direction and different socioeconomic and cultural contexts. And this is something that obviously Eat Lancet so far has been completely silent about, and that's why I'm saying it's the beginning of a new and important research agenda. Now, the question how diets can be improved in different parts of the world, and particularly in Africa, in both rural and urban areas, is something that I and my group, we have been looking into for a while. I want to give you a few glimpses of that work and how I see that evolving. You look at rural households, many of them dependent on semi-subsistence farming, then often the notion is, well, dietary diversity should increase, so why do they not just produce more foods on their small and tiny farms? Well, may sound intuitively appealing and may not be completely wrong everywhere, but when you're just looking at this graph, where's the dietary diversity of smallholder farmers in different countries of Africa? And this is nationally representative data from the LSMS ISA surveys. Where is this coming from? We're seeing that it's mostly not coming from own production, but actually from markets in all the countries here. And this is, putting the question, is increasing farm diversity really always the best approach on the question? Probably not always, and is putting the focus on markets and food environments. Yes, as agricultural economists, we look at markets for smallholders, but primarily from the perspective of how can they sell, where can they sell? We haven't really deeply looked into markets as sources of foods and understanding how the food environments for these people in rural and semi-rural and peri-urban and urban areas look like. So how to improve food environments is an important question, but brings about the question how to measure food environments. When we want to do something quantitatively, we need to measure it somehow. And this is an area that I find fascinating because there isn't really much work about measuring food environments. We have had a very recent paper, which I like a lot in food policy that came out last month, where we're combining market survey data with household survey data in a geocoded way. And we're trying to develop different measures and metrics for food environments. What I'm showing you here is market food variety metric. And this is data from Malawi, and we relate that to child nutrition. So the more diverse or the more variety we find in the locally relevant marketplaces, the better is the child for age Z score. So the better is child linear growth, nutrition outcome. That is, first of all, not super surprising, but to my knowledge, it hasn't been shown before. But interesting is that, yes, that's true for fresh food, but yes, that's even more true for moderately processed foods. And that may come as a surprise to some because processed food often has the notion of, well, it's sugar and fat dense and unhealthy. Yes, that may be true for ultra processed foods, but it's not necessarily true true for all processed foods. And I think understanding and measuring and evaluating food environments and what can be good in different situations is just a super interesting and important area for us as agricultural economists to look into. A few further questions on dietary change and what's needed. Yes, cost of diets, I've briefly mentioned that. True cost of food, also looking at all the externalities, is a thing that has become popular in the last 3-4 years. But what are good prices? I mean, we can talk about the true cost of food, and as researchers, we do that. But what are the true prices of food? And can we really internalize all the externalities? How to do that? What does that mean for food prices? What does that mean for affordability? Are obviously questions that are not very simple to answer. The role of meat and animal-sourced foods is one that we have also looked into and I find interesting. I mean, no surprise to all of you that from a climate and environmental perspective, we should all be vegans because simply the environmental and climate footprints of animal-sourced foods are so much bigger. But we also know that from a nutritional perspective, animal-sourced foods matter. This is data that we evaluated again from different countries in Africa, looking at the relationship between animal-sourced food consumption and child stunting. And we see a clearly and significantly negative relationship, meaning that animal-sourced foods improves child nutrition, reduces child stunting. And therefore, one can argue, okay, rich countries should reduce animal-sourced foods consumption, poor countries need to increase it. But my argument would rather be, well, let's understand the different situations also within countries. This last panel here shows that in a country like Ethiopia, the richest 20% consume 10 times more animal-sourced foods. This is meat in this case as the poorest. So obviously not every single person in Africa is well advised to increase her meat consumption. We need to be much, much more specific for different groups of the population. Global trade and sustainable value chains. Let me just stress the importance and not spend much time on this. But obviously, and I'm again talking now from the perspective of being in touch with many people here in Europe talking about agriculture and sustainability. And there's the widespread notion that, well, trade is bad for the environment and is even bad for food security. If only the Africans would produce all their own food, everything would be better. Well, let's look a little bit into that. These two maps that are coming from a piece by Stanley Wood and colleagues a few years back are just showing how many more people would suffer from deficiencies without trade. And we can do that in terms of energy. We can do that in terms of zinc and other nutrients. And in the paper, it's actually done for a bunch of nutrients. I just want to show you two things. First of all, well, depending on what you look at, things can change. Look at Russia here, for instance. But the more important message probably here is that Africa's food security does depend on trade. Of course, things can change. I mean, if there were local productivity growth and significantly so, Africa could somewhat reduce its trade dependence. But at the same time, there's population growth and that'll increase trade dependence, and there's climate change and that'll also increase trade dependence. So the notion that every single African country can and should strive for food self-sufficiency is obviously one that's not very realistic. And that's not at all saying that we don't need a major productivity growth in all African countries, but not necessarily with the aim of food self-sufficiency for every country. Trade also matters from a resilience perspective. We need to understand better how trade and local food systems can interact to reduce shocks and increase resilience. And we need to understand better how some of the international sustainability policies in terms of biofuels, in terms of all the sustainability standards that are coming out of the rich countries, how they're affecting poor people in Africa and elsewhere, how they are in the end impacting on food security. And I don't think that we understand all of the potential trade-offs involved in that sufficiently. Now, let me come to my last slide, the role of agricultural economics in the changing food systems landscape. We need to understand first how more sustainable food systems could and should look like. Yes, and quite a bit of work by different disciplines has been going into that. Much less work so far has been going into the second thing here, how to get there. And I think we as agricultural economists can contribute to both. Both require solid economics research, but especially the second question, how to get there, is one that certainly requires our expertise in terms of incentives, behavioral constraints, policies, and so on and so forth. Agricultural economists can do that work, and I think we can do that better as other economists, mainstream economists, because we understand the sector, we understand some of the production details, we understand the nutrition facts much better than mainstream economists. And we can do that better than some of the agronomists and other people without economic expertise. But simply the fact that we can do it doesn't mean that we are already sufficiently doing it. I think we must do it. We must address these questions in a timely and policy-oriented way. Otherwise, others neighboring disciplines will do that, and they will not wait for us, and we may become obsolete. I'm not saying that because I think we're becoming obsolete. I'm just saying that we need to see and address the bigger picture questions in a timely and policy-oriented way. We need to find the right balance between rigor and relevance. I don't think that the most rigorous causal identification that may take years or will never happen is something that the rest of the food system world will wait for. I know that Jeff Bloem is going to talk a little bit more about that question, but I think we need to get the balance right here. And we need to cooperate more closely as we have been doing with other relevant disciplines. Yes, we're doing that in some of the global modeling exercises. I don't think that we're doing that sufficiently in some of the micro-oriented work. And with other disciplines, I'm not meaning only one particular one. I mean with all those that are relevant from nutrition and health over also agribusiness, environment, climate science, and so on and so forth. So I do see great and big and important questions for our profession and just feel let us address them so that we remain relevant and become even more relevant and impactful than we have been in the last decades, and for you as you have been in the last 50 years. Thank you for your attention, and back to the chair, Eric Crawford.
Okay, thank you very much for that excellent, really very fascinating presentation on trends and priorities for research. I think your presentation illustrates well how agricultural economists can contribute to solving some of these problems. All right, Derek, I'll hand the microphone over to you at this point. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. Am I on?
Yes, you are, Derek.
Okay,
and we see your screen.
Yeah, thank you very much. And let me add my congratulations to Michigan State Food Security Group for your 50 plus years of excellent work in food policy research, particularly in Africa. I think you've got a lot to celebrate today. I came to Michigan State actually about 54 years ago today, before the Food Security Group really got going. I was only there 8 years, but it was a very formative period of my career. And then after leaving Michigan State, I had a long association almost up until quite recently with the Michigan State Food Security Group. So I think I have a perspective, a long-term perspective on your many accomplishments. Let me see if I can change the, whoops, okay. So obviously following Martin is difficult for an excellent overview of the food security situation and our challenges. As a retired professor, I think my comparative advantage is looking more backwards, but keeping it relevant to the questions of today. And as I look back over 50 years or more, there are many policy issues that we've been working on for almost the whole of that half century, which is still with us today. They're sort of perennial policy issues. And the Food Security Group has been involved in the leadership of many of them. So I'm going to focus on three of those. But one of the cross-cutting tensions in the whole area of food security research that I will highlight is the role of the development state, public versus public roles, public versus private roles. And going back, and obviously we've seen wide swings starting with very state-oriented policies in the 50s and 60s, moving to the Washington Consensus. And then around in the 2000s, I think we've started to shift back towards a more central role of the state in agricultural development. And I know in the World Development Report 2008, we actually talked about the visible hand of the state. And I suspect since 2008, we've actually seen an increasing role of the state. And in my few minutes, I'm also going to recognize just a very few of the MSU pioneers. I've highlighted them in a background paper, history paper from the 1963 to 79, and hopefully we'll get that distributed and on the web. So three topics I'm going to focus on: input subsidies, managing food price volatility, and funding agricultural R&D. Input subsidies have been with us from the beginning. The first really large country study, research study that was Michigan State was involved in was in Nigeria, the Nigerian Consortium for the Study of Nigerian Rural Development in the late 1960s. This was quite an ambitious study led by Glenn Johnson, distinguished professor at agriculture economics at MSU. In fact, I came to work with Glenn Johnson on the sort of a follow-up of that study. And a central policy instrument in that study, and in really a strategy for Nigerian rural development, was the use of input subsidies on planting materials, fertilizer, and so on, to incentivize smallholders to plant or replant export crops. So export crops were the central element of the strategy. Glenn Johnson was at Chicago School. He was PhD from Chicago. T.W. Schultz was an advisor to this study. So subsidies were quite accepted then. And then we had a falling out of, they fell out of fashion during the period 1980s and 1990s, or the period of the Washington Consensus. And then in the 2000s, there was an effort to relook at input subsidies, and they're reframed as smart subsidies. And this is a World Bank MSU study on fertilizer subsidies in Africa, led by Michael Morris, the graduate of the Michigan State University, where we talked about smart subsidies that would be targeted private sector driven, and with a clear exit strategy. And we picked that up in the World Development Report of 2008, and it came out of a meeting we had in Bamako with African policymakers and agricultural economists, and they really wanted some guidance on where the World Bank stands on subsidies. So we endorsed the smart subsidy idea in the World Development Report, and I can say that at least one or two cases it had an impact on national policies. And we really had a very rapid scale up of input subsidies in the following years, and that was helped by the food crisis of 2008 and 2012. And then MSU came along and did some really path-breaking research led by Tom Jayne and others to provide the evidence base of whether these subsidies were really smart or not. And I think the bottom line of that was that the subsidies were neither efficient nor equitable. And I think that work had some impact in terms of countries rethinking their investment in input subsidies, which were at that stage reaching a quite high share of their budgets. But as I look back in preparing these remarks, I was just amazed at the number of studies on input subsidies over the last decade or so. So whether reform to input subsidy programs and the so-called smart subsidies has matched the amount of research is a big question. The big focus now is on repurposing subsidies towards nutritionally or environmentally sustainable outcomes. I'm not very optimistic about that, given the complexity in terms of sets of actors and their vested interest. And my pessimism, I guess, comes out of my work in India, where we've had, I think, at least 30 years, no, more than 30 years, of research looking at ways to reform the input subsidy program in India, and where input subsidies now amount to a staggering $50 billion in India. And still, despite all the work from World Bank and Indian economists, it's still no progress. Second area I pick up is managing food price volatility. I think it's interesting to reflect in the 50s and 60s, and there wasn't much emphasis on food production in Africa. And here I just got a quote that's from Carl Icahn, that food production was not a priority in the late 1960s. Now, Carl Icahn then turned around very quickly in the early 1970s and became a great champion of food security in Africa, and a founding father of the food security group, not only on research, but on capacity building in Africa. The 1980s, there was MSU led some research on reform of food marketing boards, particularly the maize marketing boards of East and Southern Africa, which I think had some significant impact in terms of liberalizing food markets in the region. Didn't necessarily eliminate the maize marketing boards, but certainly reduced their role and some of the negative impacts that they were having, including heavy budgetary subsidies. Just recognize, many people to recognize here, but just recognize another pioneer of the food security group that I think Eric's already mentioned, Michael Weber. And then in the 2000s, World Bank and MSU, again, working together on looking at market-based approaches to managing price volatility, various insurance schemes, futures markets, as a way to get the state out of direct marketing of food products. I think the impacts of that were were quite limited. And then as we look at the 2020s, I think Martin has already mentioned that we're experiencing a period of more frequent shocks in global markets. We also, on top of that, a willingness of countries to unilaterally expose export bans, which only adds to world price volatility, and then a WTO, which has really been weakened. So there's a question now, countries, will we be moving back into direct state interventions into food markets to try to manage these types of shocks? One area for, I think, is worth revisiting is the role of autonomous rule-based strategic reserves like a central bank to help manage this. And then Martin's already mentioned the move to food autarky, that many countries seem to be putting even greater emphasis on moving to trying to achieve food self-sufficiency. And the quickest way to do this is through increased protection. And these are some most recent data coming out of the Agricultural Incentives Project, which is IFPRI and many others, OECD, showing that it seems like the many coastal countries, at least in Africa, are moving towards EU levels of protection for their agricultural sector. And that's quite a dramatic change from 10 or 15 years ago when most countries were taxing their agricultural sector. So the big question is, with this sort of protection, if it's real, what are the implications for poverty reduction, for nutrition, and for structural transformation? I think there's quite a big research agenda to revisit what's happening in terms of protection in low-income countries. And then my final topic is on funding research and development. We all agree, I think, that productivity growth continues to be important, and that the investment in science and technology is one of the best ways of achieving that productivity growth. And as well as other objectives such as environmental sustainability and nutritional objectives. But a perennial issue is low investment in national R&D, particularly in Africa. This has been around since the beginning. And part of this is the low visibility that research gets in public expenditures. And it's crowded out by subsidies which tend to be more visible and more politically acceptable to policymakers. So the question here is, this is an area where we should be thinking about other sources of funding. And I think one area that I have been pushing for many years, but have achieved very little results, I think, is on collective action by producers to fund research on export crops and even some food crops like rice through output levies that are accompanied by participation by farmers and farmers' organizations to ensure the relevance of that research. I estimate that those sorts of sources of funding could fund up to 1/3 of research and development in Africa and help alleviate the pressure on science budgets. Finally, an even bigger challenge for collective action is on funding international R&D. And here I recognize another pioneer, not of the food security group, but at Michigan State University, John Hanna, who really shifted the university towards international development. And in 1974, this is 3 years after the CGIAR was created, he wrote a letter to the centers. He he was talking in that letter about food systems, which I found interesting. That it's not a new term, that's been around for a long time. But he also asked a really critical question: how are we to assure long-term funding for the CGIAR? And that problem is even greater today in terms of a collective action problem among donors. We have many more donors. We have many more objectives for the CGIAR system. And then we've had a shift in the last 10 years or so from multilateral funding to bilateral funding, bilateral aid. So that makes it more difficult to fund global public goods. There is, I think, a big opportunity on regional research and development, and particularly important in Africa, where you've got many small countries where the needs for the regional cooperation. And since countries that are funding the research also receive the benefits, it should have more success. But the last figures I saw, for example, Africa Rice was set up to be funded by members. But last budget I looked at, there was only 2 to 3% of Africa Rice's budgets came from member subscriptions. So lots of opportunities and unrealized potential. So I think I probably used up my time. Lots of cross-cutting issues that I leave for the panelists that are following. One, just pick out a couple of those. One is, are we doing enough to rigorously assess the impacts of our research? I'm not aware that the Food Security Group has been doing enough in that area, but more in terms of also understanding the processes by which policy research gets used. And finally, a perennial issue for me has been the limited capacity of Ministry of Agriculture to seek out and utilize policy research. We know they don't have capacity to do policy research, but can they really use it? So with that, thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Derek. I was very interested by your comments on challenges of funding R&D and some of the capacity building issues. Before handing the microphone to Jeff Bloem, I'd like to encourage those of you in the audience who have questions to submit those through the Zoom Q&A feature. All right, thank you, Jeff. Handing the microphone over to you. Thanks.
Great, thanks. It is a huge honor to be able to contribute to this event. I hold fond memories of my time at FSG and working in the Food Security Group, and owe a lot of what I'm able to do today to my time there. I think I sort of fell in love with research in agricultural development economics during my time there. So yeah, it's really fun for me to sort of spend this time. And as I was preparing for this talk, these are big questions, and they're ambitious. I felt like I need to point out that I'm just one person, and there's many of us on the panel today, but listen to what other people have to say about this stuff too. These are big questions. So I'm going to talk about the future of research in agricultural development economics, and thinking about what we should be doing and how we should be doing it. Okay, so what kind of research should we do? I'm going to talk about 3 things. These are just 3 ideas that I think are interesting. Obviously, not an exhaustive list. There's lots of cool stuff to work on. So I'll talk about value chain intermediaries, the triple challenge, and the measurement of food insecurity. I think these topics actually complement the things that Matin and Derek were talking about. Okay, so the first, value chain intermediaries. I'm not the first to say by any means that value chain intermediaries are missing from much of the policy discussions in academic research. A lot of the folks who sort of make this point are here today and affiliated with AFRI. But it's nonetheless still true. We tend to focus on the sort of extreme ends of our food system, either producers or consumers, and this is even reflected in how we teach economic theory. So everyone who goes through PhD classes in economic theory starts with production class and a consumption class, and really nothing about how those two sides of the economy interact. If anything, they interact directly. But most of the time, consumers don't actually transact directly with the primary producers of the food. Instead, food is traded and stored and processed, transported, marketed, and these intermediary segments add a lot of value to the food. And some estimates suggest that more value is added to food in these intermediary segments than in even the primary production segments of the food system. And therefore, these intermediary segments play a really critical role, or could play a really critical role in the structural transformation process. But to study these things, we need more and better data. So we need new sampling methods, new estimation methods. Anyone who's tried to do research on value chain intermediaries sort of finds out that a lot of the publicly available data just doesn't include many of these types of actors. But with this data, we can answer really interesting and important descriptive questions, like what are the employment opportunities among these intermediary firms, and where are the highest compensated segments within agricultural value chains? What are the demographic characteristics of these jobs? And how do these firms conduct their business? Are there existing financial constraints that exist that, financial products that currently are available don't address? These are really important descriptive questions, and I'll sort of touch on the value of descriptive research at the end of the talk. The second is addressing the so-called triple challenge. And what I mean by that is to first extend sufficient, safe, and nutritious food supply to the billions of people around the world suffering from food insecurity. Second, to reduce poverty and improve livelihoods for the millions of people who are working within agri-food value chains. And then third, to do both these things by limiting environmental damage, forest and habitat loss, and also greenhouse gas emissions. So to do this, I think it's important to think about new methods that allow us to link impact evaluations that we've done in the past on development interventions within agri-food systems to environmental outcomes in the future. So this would allow us to identify synergies, maybe so-called triple wins that allow us to address this triple challenge, but also trade-offs of interventions or initiatives that perhaps helped reduce poverty, but also led to environmental damage in the surrounding area or globally, and allow us to sort of think about the trade-offs between those two important outcomes. And then the third area is the measurement of food insecurity. And this draws from specific experience that I've had. A lot of research came out in the aftermath or during the COVID-19 pandemic, trying to understand what's happening to food insecurity around the world. And sort of taking a step back, I and several others tried to draw some main overarching sort of takeaways from a lot of this research, and it was really challenging because a lot of the measures of food insecurity differed across a lot of these studies. So some studies were using macro predictions about looking into the future of food insecurity. Many other studies use survey-based measures that look backwards in time. Some of these measures measured dietary diversity or caloric consumption or hunger or maybe experiences of food insecurity. And it was difficult to sort of understand how those measures interacted together. So I think as researchers, and particularly the food security group in particular, could be leaders in trying to coordinate measures across time and space, making sure that publicly available data sets use similar methods for measuring food insecurity and hunger, and then also documenting differences and similarities between these measures. Okay, so the next part is how should we do this research? And here I'm going to talk about the credibility revolution. What I mean by that is this sort of trend or move within economics to focus our empirical work on research that's causally identified. But I want to sort of reflect on this and take a little bit of a zag and think about the value of descriptive research sort of given the credibility revolution. So I think there's sort of two possible ways to respond to the credibility revolution. And one is to see causal identification as the end of research. So what I mean by that is that the ultimate goal of research is to produce some sort of causally identified result. I think this is misguided for at least two reasons. The first is that it can lead us to work only on specific and perhaps less important questions, which ultimately undermines the usefulness of our work in addressing real-world policy questions. It also can lead us to overclaim the causal nature of our results, and then ultimately limits us in our ability to engage with the methodological or empirical weaknesses of our research, which then also ultimately undermines the ability of our ability to honestly engage with real-world policy questions. The second way to respond is to see causal identification as merely a means for research in producing a different end, which I think would be the real end of research is learning. So we often teach in econometrics, and the way that we tend to teach in econometrics, we frame identification as a binary concept. Either you have causal identification or you don't. In reality, I think causal identification is more of a spectrum. So on the left here, I have a picture. On the left, we have descriptive research. On the right, we have causal identification research. The first response that I was just talking about, you would see the sort of goal of research is to move rightward on this figure. I think the goal of research is to be moving upward on this figure towards learning. And you can do that with either descriptive research or causal identified research or anything sort of in between. So in practice, what this leads to is allows us to carefully discuss what we can and can't learn from analysis. And practically, perhaps a sort of flipping a tendency on our head of what we usually do when we write papers, which is to show dozens and dozens of robustness checks about, we can change this minor thing and my results still hold. I think we should be doing the opposite, and we can show us where our results are falling apart, show and discuss weakness checks, so to speak. And this will sort of show the sort of boundaries of what we can and cannot learn from our analysis, and helps us to be sort of more honest and transparent in the way that we're trying to do this, which ultimately will help us learn from our research. Yeah, that's what I have for today. Looking forward to having a fruitful discussion about all of this.
Okay, Jeffrey, many thanks. Dave, I'm going to turn it over to you to carry the ball for the next series of downs.
Okay, thank you. Appropriate reference, given that on Saturday there's going to be a tailgate party as part of the AFRI's 75th celebration. Okay, thank you. Look, I want to encourage everybody once again to write some questions in the Q&A. We have a couple, but please do that. I know you have many questions to ask. Now we're going to go, and I want to thank the speakers, first of all, for really, really excellent presentations. Matin, so comprehensive. You raised so many issues. Derek, your historical sweep, acknowledging what the research has been done and the issues that are thorny and just continue to plague us, right? And then Jeff, really loved a lot of the focus that you had, and the kind of talking a little bit more straight on the issue of causality versus descriptive, and maybe some false trade-offs there. So really, really good, excellent food for thought. As people are putting more questions into the Q&A, I did want to pick up on one statement that Matin made, which, but Derek, some of what you said also related to it. It really caught my attention. Matin, you suggested that public sector funding for ag research is not likely to increase, and that we need to be looking more at private sector options for that, right? So I'm just wondering if you could expand a bit on that, and what do you think? Obviously, that raises important questions of what kind of research will get done, and will it be benefiting some of the poorest participants in value chains in Africa and Asia. So I'm wondering if you could expound a bit about that, and any mechanisms that you have thought about, or that you're aware of others talking about, to tilt private sector research in a direction that will help address some of these public goods challenges that, we have always thought and continue to think we need public research for. Matin.
I mean, starting with looking at the funding, for instance, for the CGIAR, I mean, I don't have the exact numbers, but I think if you look at the last 20 years, there hasn't been a very significant increase, even though that was always the idea behind all the reform processes to get much more money. And when you look at the classical public funders, the money has gone down. The reason it has kept almost stable is because new types of funding organizations, partly from low and middle income countries themselves, partly from the foundations, but partly also from the private sector, have picked up. And if you're looking at the situation right now, I mean, in Europe, almost all the countries are more or less unable to keep spending. We have in Germany, reduced the not only agriculture research, but overseas development assistance for next year by 10%. And I'm not seeing that going to be reversed anytime soon. And of course, fortunately, Germany is not the only example. There may be other examples that are increasing, and that's great. But I would, with all the challenges, when I'm looking at our German ministry, they're currently shifting money. They talk a lot about food security, but they're shifting money from food security to climate mitigation. So that's the reality, what's happening. How can we, first of all, ensure that private sector money is picking up and also doing it in a way that poor people can benefit? Well, I mean, that's the challenge, right? And I think there's definitely good examples where private sector activities have contributed positively in agriculture and other sectors, but that's exactly the challenge that we need to get incentives and institutions right. And we're seeing that many of the private food companies are actually investing quite a bit, but most of this is going into their own limited value chains for some high value products. And I see this is not necessarily a bad thing, but it will probably remain niche. And what we need is, of course, a larger scale type of agriculture research continuing. And I don't have that perfect answer, but I see your point. Maybe Derek, as the wise man on funding, can contribute to that.
Just three quick comments. I think is already happening in terms of private investment. Hybrid maize, for example, in Asia now is pretty much private sector, and it's moving that way very quickly in Africa as well. And it's not, and in Asia it's reaching, and in Africa, full farmers. It's not it's hybrid maize, but it's quite widespread impacts. I mentioned the producer organizations and the levies on products as a way to get more funding into the system. I think look at Colombia and Uruguay and Latin America as really two of the best research systems in the region that are funded. A large share of their funding comes through producer organizations. And finally, on the CGIAR, the budget has gone up, but it hasn't gone up for global public goods. That's the problem. It's funding global public goods is not only research, but mitigation of climate change, whatever, is inherently quite difficult. And I think the biggest challenge for the CGIAR is how can they fund the global public goods, which is what they were set up to do, but it's a fairly small share of their total federal funding at the moment. And I don't have a solution to that. I notice one of the big factors in the last 10 years has been that the multilateral and regional financial organizations, the regional banks, have really cut back funding relative to the bilateral funding.
Yeah, so a super, super challenging environment. Chris Barrett talks about an idea, I don't know if he's written on this, of extending a mechanism that would extend profitable commercial patents for private companies in exchange for R&D and making it available as a public good, right? And trying to work out the details of an institutional innovation like that. So anyway, I think if this is the reality, then we do need to do a lot of thinking about institutional design for how to achieve this. I want to turn to Jeff. There are two questions here, one from Melinda Smale and one from me. I was just delighted to see your discussion of what I would call rigorous descriptive research, right? Rigorous descriptive research and the value of that. So Melinda's question is, for those of us who don't know, can you tell us what a weakness check looks like? My question, of course, is less technical. It's broader. How can we, as an ag econ profession, do you think we need to modify the incentives of individual researchers to do more, Jeff, of the kind of research that you're talking about? So Melinda's question and then this broad question.
Yeah, that's a good order of them. I was going to answer Melinda's question with thinking about incentives. Like when we publish papers, we often want to, the incentive is to put forth a paper that makes the results look as strong as possible, right? And that not always, but can push against sort of like being sort of open and honest about it. So like sometimes, you do it outside of a pre-analysis plan. Let's say that you do some robustness check on your results and your results go away. Well, the incentive is not to include that in your paper. But we really should be, doing that, because that sort of helps you understand, like, well, here's what happens. Here's the boundary of like what I can assume or the conditions under which my results hold or what have you. And that's, I think, really important when we think about learning. If learning is the goal of research, that's a really important aspect of conducting research. And yeah, I mean, like their incentives need to change to do that. I would say like there are small things that us as individuals can do, like be that change when you like are reviewing reports, and eventually like things like ultimately like we are like individuals in this big system that create those incentives. So like we as individuals can make change in those incentives. Obviously, there are sort of bigger sort of institutional incentives that are at play that are bigger than any one individual. But yeah, I mean, I think just like sort of the way we teach econometrics and the way we teach these subjects, the way we think about hiring, thinking about promotion, thinking about how we promote our own work. Sometimes we're the most proud about our sort of like carefully causally identified work, but the descriptive work can be and oftentimes is the most useful and has the most value to promote learning. So
yeah, fantastic, Jeff. Thank you. Matin, I don't know if you want to comment on that at all. You referred to, we don't always need to do the most rigorous design, and sometimes that can get in the way of having impact with our work. And of course, that impact is a key focus of this 50th anniversary celebration, right? I don't know if you or Derek wanted to make any further comments on kind of this balance.
I mean, I can, because I have to do with both mainstream economists and agricultural economists, and I think they're two different crowds, and I think that's good because for many mainstream economists, the only thing that matters is a certain set of journals, and they have very, very clear rules to play. And they're not necessarily journals where every paper has a real world relevance. It's something that's technically done nice, and as Jeff describes, probably because you have that nice data set, or because you have that nice instrument, or because you were running a large RCT, however relevant it was, but it went well and you could answer a certain question. It didn't start from that question that needs to be addressed. I mean, obviously, young people need to play by those rules, but I would always tell an ag economist, don't try to copy that. We are our own discipline, we have our own rules, and they're different. And be proud of that. We can and do address some of the real world questions. And that's something that I would always stress. Let's not to copy the mainstream economists, because when we do that, what's our value? I mean, then we're just any applied economist doing things probably worse than others from their perspective. But I think there's so many important things to do, and I see many from other fields, from climate, from biodiversity, broaching into some economic questions. They can't do that well because they don't exactly know how to do it, but they're realizing that it's important. And I'm always getting the notion, yeah, because we are not sufficiently doing it. So let's fill that space. Let's work with them and fill that space. And that's not only about rigorous causal identification. And don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm a fan of strong, rigorous research,
Yes.
but there are other criteria that matter beyond the causal impact.
Yes. Great. Excellent. Thank you very much. We have two questions in the Q&A, two additional questions in the Q&A that I'd like to get on the table. One by David Tschirley, and another from Scott Swinton. Let's start with Ezzy, and then I'll go to Scott's question. Ezzy asks, how do IFAD and other regional institutions in Africa fund R&D? What kind of role do they play? Are they big players? Are they potentially part of the solution going forward?
It's probably meant for me, although I'm not sure I can answer it. I think the major regional financial organization in Africa, African Development Bank, is putting significant resources into the regional research organizations and into the CGIAR, but there are probably others like Tom Jayne I see here who could answer that better than I could.
Okay. Okay. I don't know if you, Tom, any quick response to that, and then we'll move to Scott's question. So, Tom, if you are answering, you're muted.
Sorry, Dave, I'd ask for a restatement of the question, please. The
question was from Saweda Liverpool-Tasie, and she was asking what kind of role IFAD and other multilateral institutions play in R&D funding in Africa.
And Tom, I specifically mentioned the African Development Bank.
Okay. First of all, good afternoon. I do not, I'll cut to the chase. I don't have numbers on trends in that. So I'm afraid I can't provide an enlightened answer. No.
Okay. All right. Look, we have a couple more minutes here. Let me put the question from Scott Swinton on the table. Scott says, both Matin and Jeff called for applied economists to engage more in interdisciplinary research on pressing global challenges. Yet it seems to me that applied economists in recent years are engaging less in multidisciplinary projects than 30 years ago. Look at how CGIAR economists have concentrated in IFPRI, and university economists increasingly collaborate with other economists, or so it looks to me. What does it take to shift towards more multidisciplinary work and to the dial, and shift the dial, I guess, more from rigor toward relevance for applied economists. So we're getting a common theme here. What is the trade-off, and how do we make sure, how do we put a premium on relevance while getting as much rigor as we can? So any three of you, I guess it was directed to Matin and Jeff. Matin, do you want to start, and then we can turn to Jeff?
First of all, I couldn't agree more with the observation that Scott is making. Yes, and that is why I push that so hardly. I think it is because of how the rules in economics are set, and there's not necessarily a reward that you're getting when you're doing interdisciplinary work. You can't publish that in the top 5. Most people don't publish in the top 5 anyway, but at least trying it. I mean, that's what young people are being told in many economics programs, including in many agricultural economics programs that are trying to mimic, that are trying to be the economics programs. This is what you should be trying, and interdisciplinary work takes time. I mean, obviously, there's time in order to find a common language, and therefore we need at least to make sure that in our own journals we have a few different rules. And that's not necessarily said that this is true. It always depends what editors are you picking and what is their background, and do they only look at, well, we are the second-class economics journals, we're trying to impress them. And I think we really, as a profession, we need to define our rules and don't try to copy anyone, but try to do that what's important. And this needs to be reflected in how we're teaching our graduate students and how incentive structures in our departments and universities and other institutions are being shaped. So it's not something that, it's really something for our profession.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Matin. Jeff, you said basically we need to be the change that we wish in our profession, right? Do you want to say any more about this? There's so much great stuff we could talk about here. We only have one more minute, I would say.
Okay, I can keep it. I mean, I agree with a lot of what Matin said. Like, the language, I think, is a huge thing. There's certainly a sort of a lack of reward or benefit of interdisciplinary research. But also the costs are super high. Like when you are working with a fellow economist, you've been trained in sort of like a similar language. It's just easier. And oftentimes, even if it's the same method, empirically something is the same, the language we use is different, and that can lead to lots of confusion. So obviously this is like a longer term solution, but like more interdisciplinary teaching would help us lead in the future to easier interdisciplinary collaborations.
Yeah, excellent. Great. Would love to discuss this for a lot longer. We have to come through with an in-person gathering here on campus in the future so we can explore some of these issues a little more at leisure. I'm now going to switch back to Eric, who will present the next panel. Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks, Matin. Thanks, Derek. Thanks, Jeff.
Okay, thank you, Dave. I'm simply going to pass the baton or the microphone to Saweda, who will be coordinating the panel on research.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Eric, and thanks to the panelists for that excellent discussion. And so as Eric mentioned earlier, we have 2 panels. And so the first panel is really going to be focusing in on research. And it's really my honor to moderate this panel of distinguished scholars. I'm going to just try to do a quick, brief introduction of each of them and sort of why we think that they're really important and key for this kind of a conversation. I'm also going to remind all of us that if you do have questions, please put them in the Zoom Q&A And there'll be time at the end where you can also just raise your hand and ask them. So I'm going to start with Will. So Will Masters is a professor of food policy and economics at the Friedman School of Nutrition at Tufts, and the co-author of the new textbook, Food Economics, Agriculture, Nutrition, and Health. Will's work is at the intersection of nutrition and economics. So that's a strong asset that he brings to this conversation. And he leads the Food Prices for Nutrition project that computes the cost of affordability of healthy diets that Matin showed us some maps with that data, which has been incorporated also into the FAO stat data. And this work on metrics for capturing the cost of an affordable diet, for me, is a great example of how applied economists can bring evidence to bear on understanding sort of what is needed for households, governments, donors who want to see an increased consumption or increased availability and consumption of healthy and nutritious diets. So welcome to Will. Vincenzina Caputo is our very own AFRI professor and Homer Nolan Endowed Chair in Consumer and Food Economics in AFRI. She develops and applies cutting-edge methods to understand how people make food choices and how these choices impact the food system and also policy. Her methodological work on improving the validity and reliability of experimental methods, particularly discrete choice experiments, is generally really innovative. But I think that this can be leveraged much more to increase our understanding of how we improve consumer demand for safe and nutritious foods in developing regions as well. And this is really a hot topic now, talking about how supply chains respond to consumer demand, but how do we nudge behavior? How do we increase the demand for nutritious and safe food? I'm going to move on to welcome Vincenzina, and I'm going to move on to Ben Belton, is also our own AFRI associate professor and also a research fellow at IFPRI. Ben is a leading global scholar on aquaculture and fisheries development, but his research interests are quite broad, spanning value chains, food systems, livelihoods, rural transformation, agrarian change, and their links to issues of food and nutrition security, poverty, and well-being more generally, but also the environment. So Ben brings an interdisciplinary perspective to this panel because he's a social scientist with more than 15 years of experience living and working in South and Southeast Asia, but working across multiple disciplines, including GIS, economics, anthropology. And I've worked with Ben, and I'm always fascinated as how he switches so quickly between these different fields and is almost an expert in all of them. So I think he brings that experience and richness to this conversation. So welcome, Ben. And the last, but definitely not least, is Hope Michelson. Hope is an associate professor in the Department of Agricultural and Consumer Economics at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. But she's also affiliated with the Harris School of Public Policy, University of Chicago, Northwestern University's Institute on Complex Systems, and JPAL. Hope's research is really at the intersection of development and ag. And she focuses on small farmers and firms in low-income countries and on the relationships between agriculture, natural resources, markets, and household outcomes. Amongst the many different perspectives that Hope brings to this conversation, she brings additional insights on input supply chains, which I think is an important part of the food systems conversation, not often as widely discussed as output supply chains, even though, as Jeff rightly alluded, discussions at the midstream and the downstream of food value chains are generally less studied or less discussed in research and policy conversations compared to discussions about farm-level activities or issues and consumer level. But even within the midstream and the downstream, there's much less on the input supply chains, and this is work that Hope has been doing. So welcome, Hope. I know that our panelists probably have some thoughts about the great presentation, the keynote presentation, and also the reflections. But I'm gonna start off with some questions that I hope will help us to start learning from your perspective, but also give you the chance to respond to the keynote, as well as the reflections by Jeff and Derek. So I'm gonna start with you, Will. And I know that I'm always talking about this cost of affordable diets, the metrics, and I think it's really valuable. I'm seeing a lot of conversations in various developing countries about that metric. And so I just wanted to ask you if you could share with us a little bit, sort of drawing from your experience working on the development of that cost of affordable diet indicators. And now that you're seeing their expansion and use, not only in FAO stat database, but even in different countries, what would you say are some emerging issues or research questions that you think would be helpful for ag and development economists to be thinking about trying to understand or answer with these indicators, or as a consequence of the information that is now available to us through this indicator?
Yeah, thank you, Saweda, and thanks to everybody participating in this amazing session. I think this new metric of affordability of healthy diets does actually answer Matin's call for agricultural economics to be distinctly itself, and for the ag and applied econ profession to not just be like economists doing the most mathematically tractable version of the world, but to work with other disciplines to make a version of decision-making and human choice and policy that is in fact respectful of nature and understands the constraints. And the issue, of course, for ag econ is that for decades, and in the case of the FSG, like literally 50 years, that collaboration was in colleges of agriculture with agricultural economists. So what we've done with the cost and affordability metric is to bring economics to nutrition. And that, for me, was really difficult. So what Jeff Bloem discussed about the difficulty of this interdisciplinary work, when people are talking about the same thing with completely different language, has been a really difficult journey. And I think it is rewarding. It does give us this new descriptive research that is simply identifying facts about the world and communicating those facts in a way that I hope lives up to Jeff Bloem's ambition to provide learning, and I think does live up to Matin's goal for us to be distinctly ourselves, to the legacy of the MSU Food Security Group in being very connected to countries and to governments, which is one of the great legacies that I think Derek's history helped to clarify just how, I've encountered MSU FSG group members who just know so much more about places than other economists do. John's stats is his relationship with Mali, is just so deep and so important. So that combination of working with governments, paying attention to other disciplines that tells us how the world really works in a biophysical sense, but bringing our economics toolkit to discover new facts and then also work on causal inference, that's what I've taken away, I guess, as what this work has involved.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that, Will. I think very nice kind of reflection on kind of the conversations. And are you currently using that data to answer any specific research questions, or has the findings coming from the metric actually inspired some new questions that maybe you or your team are beginning to look at now because you have this data available and are able to look across countries, across regions, or across regions within a country?
Absolutely, yes. This new way of describing retail food environments, where we're measuring access in terms of the least expensive locally available items to meet an overall dietary requirement for all of the bioactive compounds, the essential nutrients and other attributes of each distinctive food group. That's giving us a whole new lens on the world. So we're comparing across regions and time periods, as you suggested, what are the cost levels of meeting human health requirements, then comparing those cost levels to incomes to understand what is accessible, what's affordable, and then comparing the actual choices from among the affordable items to see how revealed preferences are so different from the actual health needs. And so, yes, it's absolutely opening up a whole new window of research to try to understand, to build that learning agenda that Jeff described through descriptive stylized facts and then also causal inference.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think so. I mean, I think even just listening to your presentation in India and about, kind of what drives those higher costs and how that varies in different regions. And then you can think of both research to understand sort of how to get supply response and maybe reduce the cost of some certain elements where governments should prioritize, And then, as you said, there's a lot of descriptive that could be done to understand the heterogeneities within countries and within different kinds of income groups or within different ways of, kind of looking at a society. So really, really exciting stuff. So I'm just going to move on to Vincenzina. And Vincenzina, I'm kind of thinking of a similar kind of idea, but now leveraging on your work and experience of using these, novel methods to learn how people make their choices and also sort of to evaluate the effect of these choices on food systems and policies. I know you've worked across the globe. So FSG does a lot of work in developing regions, and I know that you've done work in developing regions as well. So could you just start off by maybe sharing a little bit about some of the work that you have done applying these novel methods in the developing country context, but then also share also some research opportunities that you see in terms of kind of research areas or issues around data collection or methods coming out of that work. So it's a two-part question, but I hope they're connected and it's easy to navigate.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you, Saweda, for inviting me to be part of this conversation. As you have mentioned, most of my work is focused in developed countries like the US and in Europe. But since joining MSU, I have also had opportunities to extend my work in developing regions, particularly in Africa and Asia. And one example of this work is actually our collaborative project in Nigeria, in which we evaluate the market potential of food safety and eventually aflatoxin-safe products. We focus on this particular topic because it's policy relevant, as aflatoxin contamination poses a number of health concerns, especially on women and children. And so there is a need to find market incentives that will allow consumers to make safer food choices. And while most of the work has been done on the production side, so what type of technologies or innovations producers should use to provide healthier food options, there is not much work on the demand side, right? How should we signal food safety to consumers? And if the market has those new instruments, what will be the reaction on the consumer side? So during those very nice presentations done by the prior speakers, there is one topic that has emerged, which is, we are applied economists. We use data to learn and inform policy. This is how I see it. And this, learning process can be descriptive or causal, right? But still, we have a learning process. But regarding whatever we do, right, whether we describe or we learn from a description or whether we learn from like causal research, we need data. We are applied economy, so we need data to inform policy. And so while doing this work in Nigeria, and you are aware of this because you were part of this project, one of the main limitations that researchers like us face is that we don't have data available, especially at the consumer level data, right? So we don't have data because in many instances, we want to measure demand for something that doesn't exist. So if we want to improve food safety, we need to provide food, food that is safe or food that is nutrition. And these food options are not always available in those markets. So we can use scanner data, for example, right? And so one way many of us deal with this problem is that we start big surveys, big, data collection efforts. And in many instances, if we don't have the product, we need to do surveys. And so when working with primary data collection that is based on hypothetical survey, we may end up having, especially in studies in which we want to measure the demand or the willingness to pay for new items, we face the problem that people tend to overestimate what it will actually, right, pay in actual supermarkets, right? This is known in the literature as hypothetical bias, which is this difference between what people say in an experiment versus what people say or do in an actual environment. And this is the same issue that other scientists looking at time preferences or risk preferences face. There are different studies done in developing regions where you see different results, and because there are different tasks that people do, but also, depending on whether those experiments are done with economic incentives or not. So we did the study, and we wanted to, in addition to answer our empirical question to inform policy, we also want to advance methods. What can we do to improve or reduce hypothetical bias in developing regions? Now, a lot of work has been done in the US and Europe, but much less has been done in developing countries. So what we did was we rented a shop in one of the biggest markets in Nigeria, Ibadan, and we went there. For me, it was my first experience in Nigeria, and we created a simulated supermarket where people could go see the products and then eventually purchase the product. And we implemented, both hypothetical and real experiments, so with economic incentives and without economic incentives, because we really wanted to understand whether hypothetical bias was an issue also in that particular context. And one of the additional challenge then we face is that we didn't have the aflatoxin safe, option. So we had to buy the product, test the product, create a nice packaged option, and then have a label in the safe options. So we did all of this to obviously find whether there is a demand for aflatoxin safe products, and there is a demand, right? But we also found that the willingness to pay in a hypothetical setting was 5 times higher, right, than in a real setting, right? Which poses a lot of issues when we go to the policymaker or to the producer, and we provide estimates, right, on how this product should be marketed. So I wanted to provide you, with this example first, to point out that creating new data is important, and in many instances we need to do that because we don't have existing data. But also to highlight that there is also a need to advance methods, ways to elicit preferences. And this is, I guess, what our work should be also focusing on.
Yes, thank you so much for that. And I think that just kind of in that example that you gave, kind of thinking about how you can use, of course, it's a huge task in kind of collecting data, but how you can use or how you can understand issues around kind of consumer demand nudges. I think one of the things that we also did there was also testing the importance of information to change behavior, which I think, again, goes back to some of the things we talked about earlier in terms of increasing the consumption of, the demand and consumption of nutritious, safe foods. But then also being able to test methods. What are the appropriate methods for doing these kinds or this kind of learning within the developing country context, and where you might have different levels of hypothetical bias or drivers of hypothetical bias. So I think that was a great example. And I'm going to actually even push a little further to ask you that one of the things that Jeff mentioned, and I think many of us at FSG, so Tom Reardon and many of us work in the midstream and the downstream, where there's much less understanding. And as Jeff rightly put, these are important mediators, right? Important determinants of the prices that farmers are getting, and the quality and the safety and the price that consumers are paying. So really important actors. Have you done any work, or do you have any experience either from the work that you've done in the developed countries that is actually in the midstream, and what do you see as potentials there? Because that is a space that I think FSG has played a leading role in generating evidence in the midstream and the downstream. Now, can we move even further in some of the kind of work that you're doing and the methods that you're using?
Yeah, so thanks for the follow-up, right? And I would like to also go back to what Martin, said in setting some of the key ideas for future research, where health and sustainable diets should be at the center, right? And to do that, again, we need to find ways to track, right, what people eat and how and where they eat the food they buy, and this is important because I saw different graphs, right? And we were observing different years, right? But in those different years, we observed trends. So changes in what people eat and where they do eat food. And this has implications, right? Not only in terms of sustainability and what people purchase for the producers, but also has an effect on malnutrition. And so what do we do as applied economists to inform this process? there was also a question in the Q&A session where it was asking, did you find any difference between, boy and girls? And the answer of Martin was, we don't have individual level data to do that, right? So again, we go back, right? And to the consumer side, there is not much out there. We don't have enough data to work on in terms of changes over time. And those changes over time are important to inform policy. And so the need of longitudinal data is important, which will require data collection efforts. And in this regard, I think that the Food Security Group has resources, right, both financial insight at Michigan State to lead this process and eventually create data that are at the consumer level, which will inform eventually this process. But in addition to that, right, we also need new elicitation methods. So when you go to the field and you collect new data on what people eat, usually what we do is to collect an individual choice. So for example, in our study in Nigeria, we focus on maize, right? But then to inform this big policy process, which is, we want to nudge more sustainable and healthy diets, we need to know more about what people eat overall, right? And we also want to know that what they eat has an effect on food markets, but also on their health. So we need to find methods through which we can also infer nutrient intakes, both at macro and micro level. So this was something that we observed in the US as well, or in Europe. We have scanner data here, but they come with a lot of limitations in terms of rigorous research and sometimes inability to find a good instrument to address endogeneity issues. And so what we did with Jason Lusk, is a professor and dean at Oklahoma State University, we developed this new model, which we call new method, which we called food baskets. So basically what we did was, instead of showing in those data collection efforts people single products, why we don't just show them what they will face when they go to the grocery stores? And so what we did was to ask them to make a mixture of choices. So do they choose meat, and which type of meat, and meat versus fish, which type of meat and fish? And what about veggies, right? And if you do so, you are also able to estimate cross-price elasticities. And those are key indicators to inform policy. Indeed, going back to the food choice literature, even in developing countries, I found out that there are many studies looking at price elasticities. And so we have seen this methodology being applied we published this paper in Food Policy in 2022. There's been a couple of other applications done, but also other applications in other fields like environmental economics with farmers and transportation. And, our hope is to also see some application done in developing regions, because it could enrich the policy debate. And we also show in this work and following work how policies can be estimated and which kind of policies, right, or which kind of policy evaluation can be done through this data.
Okay, no, thank you so much. I might come back to you on the issue of the transportation work that you said, but I want to move on to Hope. And so Hope, I guess I already mentioned that, your recent work and the evidence that you're generating on the input supply side is really fascinating and, kind of very interesting in terms of the work that you're doing, collecting data from firms, and then also kind of looking at the input supply chain, which I believe is sort of less studied even within the midstream and the downstream of food supply chains generally, or input and output supply chains. So given the work that you've done on input supply chains in developing regions, what would you say are some, remaining knowledge gaps? I know you recently did also a review on this topic. What would you say are some areas, some potential areas that you think could be interesting for us as applied economists, ag economists, people working in this space to, should be thinking about, sort of given the work that you've done and kind of things that you guys your team is learning?
I think there's just massive opportunities, and I laughed because we did a review on non-labor ag input quality, so the evidence in that space that came out last year in food policy. And now we're working on, a group of us, just a review for the annual reviews on input dealers and like input markets. So we sort of backed up, and because I think as a part of that review and then work that some of us were doing, we had the sort of collective realization that, oh, there's there's like the contextual space for the quality question is similarly full of opportunities. So I was, working on that this morning, and it's there's so many important questions, and it's a hard space. And so, so far my work in that space it started off a little bit opportunistically because we were working on fertilizer quality. And as a part of that, we really had to work with ag input dealers. And so we ended up with a 3-round census for a region of Tanzania. So we went back 3 times over 5 years. And just looking at that data set, which is one region in Tanzania, but we have evidence to suggest that this is not an idiosyncratic finding, because we've sort of tried to find other panels like this. So just from that sample, we can see some sort of interesting questions, right? So for example, and questions I think that both are important within the ag econ space, the sort of ag econ development space, but then also that challenge or contribute to some of the space on just small firms in low-income countries, which I think is really interesting and important. So, I think one thing that we're contributing there as ag economists is really looking deeply into a sector. And so some of that broader literature, for example, on firms tends to be, cross-sectoral and sort of lacks a lot of specificity in terms of the constraints and the opportunities that those firms face. And so, as we're getting deep into understanding what's going on with these ag input dealers, then I think one question that emerges is like, well, how are these firms sort of special in some way? Is the ag input space special? Or, in general, does the small firm space maybe need to take a more sectorally specific look at what's going on with some of these firms, because maybe looking at the averages across firms are sort of missing some of the important dynamics. So that's just an example of the way that just looking at these firms raises some of these bigger questions about other literatures as well. So for example, we see enormous amounts of entry and exit annually by these firms. And because of the nature of the sample that we have, and because it's a census, and because we're careful about going back at the same time to the same markets, we know we're not just capturing seasonal fluctuations in the sample, so we can be pretty confident in what we're finding. But there's growth over the 5 years in this sample in the number of ag input dealers operating in these markets. I think 15% growth annualized, but we see tons of dropout. So people are just coming in and dropping out after a couple of years. And so we're doing a lot of analysis just to understand, which are the firms that are dropping out, what are the spatial patterns in that dropout rate. And then we have a paper where we're pushing to try to think about, ag input dealing, ag input sales are they're really important actors, and they're understudied, and we're expecting them to do a lot. So we're expecting them to perform, they've got to take risks in terms of stocking new technologies. They've got a whole bunch of work in Kenya where we're looking at, the decision of ag input dealers whether or not to stock new hybrids when they've got these sort of 20-year-old like sure things in stock. Like, why are they taking a chance or not taking a chance on new technologies? But we're expecting them to do that. They're this last link in the provision of new technologies to small farmers. They bear a lot of risk when they make these decisions. Ag input sales are a wild business where you've got like a lot of demand for 3 weeks of the year, maybe 6 weeks if you've got 2 agricultural seasons. You've got credit constraints, timing, rainfall, it's just wild. So I think it's such a fruitful space. It's a nice like model system that we can use to think about technology adoption, extension, information, asymmetries, credit constraints, risk. There's just so much there, I think. And it's this real sweet spot of real policy relevance. I think we really, in this survey of the literature, there are implicit assumptions all over the place about how these ag input dealers are operating and what we think they can do. And we have to look under the hood of those assumptions and really understand what's going on. So I really hope people work on it. And yeah, for lots of reasons. So
yeah, no, thank you. I mean, I think you really nicely, hit on some of the key kinds of issues and questions that we can learn from studying these ag input dealers. And I was going to ask, kind of what are the attrition rates in your 5-year panel? I mean, and you're saying that they're going in and out, but how many of them are you actually able to track over the 5 years that you can actually kind of look at systematically? I mean, do you kind of,
I think over the 5, I'll give you a sense, although I'm going to get the numbers a bit wrong. I think over the 5 years in this one region of Morogoro, it's 102 markets, right? So 102 market centers. I think what we see, we survey like 480 firms over that period. And but there's only 230 that are continuously open over the 3 rounds that we survey them. Does that make sense? So, yeah. But we did some cool stuff. So I have a student that's finishing this paper, and she actually did a phone survey where she called up a lot of the people that quit to try to understand why. And there's all these assumptions in the dev literature about people buying themselves a job, essentially, right? And like that one interpretation of these high dropout rates is that people are just, these are, low barrier to entry firms, and you can just buy some fertilizer and sell it along. But she did some survey work where she talked to these firm owners, and it really challenges that assumption. I mean, a lot of these folks made pretty significant investments and really expected to be in business in 10 years. So it wasn't like a stopgap measure to smooth their own consumption, for example, over time. So that's very interesting too. So yeah, really high dropout rates, but net increases in the number of actors, at least over this period. Now that ends before the big shocks happen during COVID and the fertilizer price crisis. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens in terms of entry and dropout during that kind of a period. So
yeah, no, I mean, and I think that, I mean, Jeff is here, and I think Jeff and I are working on another, I've been working on another paper where kind of building off on, which links to the literature that has shown that, like you were saying, agro dealers are facing all these risks, but then what are also the opportunities, potential opportunities, because they are playing roles of providing extension, sometimes providing credit to farmers or giving farmers inputs on credit. So they're playing all these roles. Which of them are able to play it? Which of them are able to play it well? What is, so as you were talking about, who's staying in, how does that vary with scale? So I think that there seems to be like a lot of questions there, and a lot of scope for, good research questions, and maybe even possible getting panel data, right? So I think that
would be fantastic.
Starting off with exactly is a great insight from those comments. So I'm going to move on to Ben. Mindful of time, and I'm hoping that we can come round again for at least one more round. So Ben, you have been working on food systems for almost 2 decades, and working across multiple disciplines. So in your work as sort of the expert on fish, but really working with researchers across multiple disciplines, and oftentimes patient to work with us economists, but not only ag economists, obviously, what would you say are some of the kind of key elements of the sorts of research questions and the associated methodology that you feel really helps to place your work in places where it has a lot of impact? So I think we've had a lot of call today about, we want to maintain rigor, but we want to answer good questions. And then we also want to, place the work in good peer-reviewed journals, but we also wanted to have policy relevance. So what has been your experience sort of working across multiple disciplines and being able to sort of, kind of place your work in a lot of these really high-level conversations, as well as in good, reputable journals?
Yeah. Thank you, Saweda. So I think I've had a sort of pretty eclectic sort of academic background, and so because of that, I've always been interested in collaborating with people with a lot of different interests that sort of match this broad set of research interests that I have. And I really liked Matin's sort of comment to not try to copy anyone. I guess because I haven't had this kind of quite rigid disciplinary training, I've just tended to kind of cherry pick from anywhere that I felt was interesting and was relevant to what I was seeing. I think another key thing is really spending a lot of time in the field. I feel like kind of any insight that I've ever had that has any value has really sort of come about from just being in the field, observing, talking to people, trying to figure out what's happening, and then put that into some kind of a sort of theoretical framework, and sort of try and explain it. And so that's been sort of really crucial to sort of finding out new things, getting new ideas, developing new questions to test. And I think also because I sort of work with quite a variety of people, then I've really sort of come to value mixed methods a lot. So actually my original training was in sociology. And so the first sort of work that I did for quite a long time was almost completely qualitative. And over time, I've integrated more and more quantitative work. And really now I see the two as being extremely complementary. So to be able to interpret correctly what the quantitative data is telling us, we need the qualitative context to do that. But also having the quantitative part really enriches the qualitative part. It makes it look more rigorous and sort of strengthens. And so I think if you can do sort of good mixed methods research that tells a really convincing story, then it's not actually too difficult to place it in what I would consider to be good journals anyway. So places like, for instance, World Development or Nature Food maybe. And so, working in FSG, working in FPRE, they're institutions that value publications in those kind of journals. So it's never been an issue, publishing like that. But I also think, of course, like whatever journal you're trying to publish in, the framing is always crucial. So how do you frame that data, that information in the context of debates, and particularly policy relevant debates, and also sort of the quality of the data, the quality and depth of the analysis. And so, yeah, you don't need to demonstrate causality in order to publish something that's really convincing if you have all of those elements. So I think that's the point. I guess also, the point about being in the field a lot is that, in developing countries, context is changing so rapidly. Very often what people think is the case was the case 10 years, 20 years ago, no longer is the case. And so it's actually quite easy to discover new things in a way. You kind of trip over them all the time almost if you sort of put in the hours.
Yes, no, excellent. And actually that's, I was just going to piggyback on that comment that you made about sort of, this, kind of a lot of the research questions, good policy relevant questions come from going to the field. I totally can resonate with that. So given your work in the food system space, working in Southeast Asia, and I think increasingly in Africa, are there some research questions or some issues within kind of food systems that you think are kind of not yet on the radar, or kind of that you think are kind of really important and should be given more attention, that by ag or applied economists or other collaborators and yourself or your research team within this idea of sort of the ongoing transformation of food systems in developing regions?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I guess kind of an obvious one, and one that Martina's also touched on, is climate change. I mean, obviously, this is sort of this increasingly going to become this sort of existential issue, right? And so I've just over the last year or two started really thinking about how climate change is impacting fisheries and aquaculture, and then how are people adapting to that, but then how are those impacts and those adaptations shaped by a whole series of other sort of processes, and so you could actually see that quite nicely from one of Matin's slides. You have this sort of very complex set of interacting factors that kind of mediate these effects and people's ability to adapt. But sort of reviewing the literature on how climate change is impacting fisheries and aquaculture, it's clear that there's a lot of modeling, there's a lot of sort of hypothetical, or there's a lot of sort of very macro scale, and you know, we know from being in the field, from talking to people, that these changes are already playing out on the ground. There's much less sort of empirical research documenting how this is actually happening, and also sort of the intersections with all of these other processes, with markets, with pollution, with you know, a whole range of other different things. And so I guess maybe agriculture has it somewhat better covered than aquaculture and fisheries, but I think there's still a huge amount of sort of just basic empirical work that we can do to try and understand just quite what's going on. Yeah, okay. I mean, and another thing that's come up in one of the questions in the chat also is sort of the effects of conflict and insecurity, which, you know, seems to be more and more common in many different locations. And so sort of understanding sort of the resilience of food systems and value chains to shocks related to conflict, and sort of understanding how actors in those value chains are able to continue operating, or whether they're able to continue operating, but often they do. How do they manage to do that? What does that mean for the resilience of those value chains, or for the food system as a whole? And then also, we obviously have lots of sort of overlapping or interacting shocks. So conflict plus climate change, or conflict plus trade. And so I think going forward, unfortunately, that's going to be something that we need to deal with and address a lot more.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you so much. I mean, actually, this has been really exciting. I think, you know, if there are any grad students here, or all of us, I'm hoping that you're grabbing on some, you know, areas that resonate with you, for some areas to explore further, and kinds of data to collect. I didn't see any questions in the Q&A, so I went on a little bit longer, but we need to wrap up in the next 5 minutes. And so I think there's a question from Tom. So but it's not in the chat. So I'm just going to ask Tom if you could just, you know, speak out to your question and to which panelist it's addressed.
Great, thank you. Okay, yes, I'm enjoying this session a lot, and I have a question that I think any one of you may be able to answer, and be curious to hear your perspectives on this. As Matin said, you know, there's the questions about what needs to be done. How do we move to regenerative agriculture? How do we move to more climate smart agriculture? How do we move to more resilient systems, input supply, et cetera, et cetera? And then there's the question of how, and which actors need to be involved in that process. And in Africa, I noticed that there's kind of two competing models, that maybe more than two. So there's one model that I think the Gates Foundation may take this approach. They kind of have their doubts about kind of investing in public goods and African public goods. And so they're setting up a 1 Acre Fund and other kind of comparable new organizations to perform these tasks of providing inputs to smallholders, providing services to smallholders. And then, you know, the more traditional model of investing in public sector, NAREs, National Agricultural Research Systems, there's at least two competing models. And I'm wondering if any of you will, Ben, Hope, Vincenzina, and Saweda, whether you have data points that you can pull out that would add to this, or whether research is being done on kind of the relative merits of these alternative approaches to promoting these, improved regenerative systems in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. I see Will has unmuted. Did you unmute because you had something to say? I think we can open it up. We do have just a few more minutes, but I'd like to give space for responses to that. So Will, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think Hope can speak a lot more to the input side than I can, but I think the same question applies on the food and healthfulness of food, the nutritional value of food side. And, the point I would make is that, what's so often framed as an either or is really a both and, where the private sector success and the public sector's success are so intertwined. You cannot have one without the other, that a successful, thriving private sector comes from a successful enabling environment provided by governments. In the absence of successful governments, you do not have a successful private sector. In the absence of a successful private sector, you cannot have a successful government program. And that the key trick is to get both the chicken and the egg started at the same time. And that involves, in some sense, standing up a lobby, standing up an interest group, creating the professional associations that can call for the public goods, the institutions, and the public infrastructure, and the public investments. And so, we're trying to do that a little bit on the nutritional side of food systems. And I would be very curious to hear from Hope about, work on input quality and whether the input trade associations can lobby for the R&D pipeline, can lobby for the quality assurance that you've shown is often more there than people think, but the degree to which it's a both and situation, and we need to build the private sector so that it's a constituency and a lobbying force that then elicits the public sector success, the state capacity that's needed for private sector business. Thank you. Hope, do you want to jump in?
I completely agree. I'll give two examples because I know we're running low on time. I'll just very briefly. So what Will said is exactly right. And, you can see with the input side, the way that limitations and, the absence of infrastructure, enabling infrastructure from the public sector is weakening the private sector. And so, for example, with fertilizer quality in Tanzania, the urea quality is fine. It doesn't really make sense from a technical or a business perspective for there to be quality issues in urea, and yet we see so many farmers are concerned about the quality, and we now done some work that shows that it impacts what they're purchasing, right? So this is actually, so because you have an underfunded regulatory system, and everybody knows that, and you've got all these people coming in and out without certification, you're kind of hamstringing the industry as a whole. The other example I'll give, just because I think it's so interesting, and I'm hoping somebody on this call will then email me afterwards so we can talk about it. So I'm doing a bunch of work with Summit on seed systems with their seed systems group. And I was stunned to find out at the beginning of this work a couple of years ago that there's no independent varietal trials. So in the United States, I'm at a land grant, I'm at the U of I, and there's independent. That's one thing that the land grant universities did, was they tested seeds and made that publicly available. It doesn't exist in Kenya, which has a pretty sophisticated seed system. And so you've got, I think like 600 varieties of maize have been released into the marketplace since 1960 something. And if you talk to farmers, they're like, I don't know. I'm not sure what to do. There's so many choices. Everybody's growing something different, and there's no independent assessment that people can look at to make choices. So then you just have a lot of chaos and, in an informational environment that makes making informed decisions really challenging. So I've been thinking about that a lot. So I think that's great that Tom asked that question. And on the input side, it's absolutely important.
Yeah. So thank you, Will and Hope for taking that. I mean, we are out of time, and we are supposed to have a few minutes before we move to the next panel. But I did want to just give the chance for you to give a last, kind of not parting words, but maybe just kind of last thoughts as we think about, FSG, and also even broader than FSG, all of us who work in the space of applied economics in the development space. Just some last words for the 50th celebration, research or not, obviously. So I'll start with you, Vincenzina, and then I'll move on as I see on the screen. So Vincenzina, just some last words.
Yeah, so first of all, again, thanks for inviting me to be part of this conversation. And I see many opportunities, but within research domains that have not been fully explored in developing regions, and most of which have to do with diets, nutrition, and sustainable food choices. But also, we have this kind of upstream, midstream, and downstream, right? But I would like to see more work that integrates those different nodes and trying to understand how, what is the relationship between them. I'm sure the Food Security Group has the resources and the right people to lead these efforts together with our, people within our association. And so, yeah, thanks for the invitation. And I wish you and the entire Food Security Group all the best in this new, adventure.
Next 50 years. Thank you very much. Yeah, so can we have 30 seconds of parting words, maybe? Hope, I see you next.
Mine's right. Thanks for including me. I think there's enormous opportunities, and I for one have learned a lot from the way that you all engage policy in the kinds of research questions that you ask, and then the way that you make that research available. So I really admire the group for doing that, and I hope that they continue to do that as they take on some of these new really policy relevant topics. So
thank you so much. Will?
Yeah, I guess for the next 50 years, I would just really wonder about the definition of food security and the degree to which the FSG group, is in a position to incorporate these measures of diet quality and health, which of course requires very careful attention to nutrition and the science of public health and food composition, which is, almost completely absent, from all of the FSG's work up to now, because when we speak of food security in terms of health, it does require a different toolkit. It really is legitimately different. It's different. These are different metrics. It's a different world, different language, and it's a hard question. So that's a choice for FSG: is do you want to stay on the agriculture side of things, and to what extent do you want to speak about human health? You don't need to.
Yes,
it's an opportunity.
Thank you. I do think that there are a group of people who are moving into the food environment and also to the nutrition side. And so I think that's a call for us to consider whether we want to do more of that. And I think that's a very good question. Last but not least, 1 minute or 30 seconds, Ben.
Yeah, thank you, Saweda, and thanks a lot for the opportunity to be part of this. It's been a really nice conversation. So I really second a lot of the comments from earlier on, that sort of many of the issues that we're dealing with in FSG, so food security itself, climate change, nutrition, conflict, they're all systemic issues. And because they're systemic issues, they really require broad interdisciplinary, even transdisciplinary approaches. And so that means that it's really essential to collaborate widely within the university and with outside universities, so sort of work with people who have those complementary methods, complementary perspectives to help us do that. And I think sort of based on the conversations within FSG recently, we're very much sort of gearing up to move more in that direction and sort of expand into those areas. And so I sort of welcome that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks to our audience for your engagement and also for staying with us. And thanks so much to the panelists. I'm going to hand it over to Dave. I think we do have a few minutes before we move to the next panel, but I'll hand it back to Dave. Thank you once again.
This whole session is about, what FSG should be doing, what kind of research, and how it should be doing it. You've obviously heard a ton about what we should be doing. You've actually heard a lot about how we should be doing it, but we're really going to take a deep dive into that in this next panel, focusing on partnering and collaboration. How do we do that for maximum equity equitability in relationships and maximum impact. And we're going to have two panelists from collaborators in Asia and Africa, as well as two of our very own from MSU. So this whole session has been organized and designed to help us with our partners think about what kind of research we need to do and how we need to be doing it, right? And increasingly in today's world, we think about that how in the context of how do we partner with our local organizations in partnerships that are both equitable and maximally impactful, right? And we think that the how of how we do our work, right? The how of the research, the how of the partnering is actually really, really crucial to achieving impact. And it's based on a very simple observation, which is that those of us, here at US universities, European universities, even in African and Asian universities, those of us doing the research, we can't, there's a lot of talk about scaling nowadays. We cannot scale anything. We have to understand processes of change in local systems, and we have to figure out how we can do our work in a way that feeds into that and gets massaged through the whole local process, right, into better, incrementally better, perhaps not as quote unquote good as we would like, but incrementally better policies and programs over time. So we're going to be talking about partnering and collaboration to achieve this. We have 4 panelists. I'm going to introduce one panelist first because we recorded an interview with her, and then I will introduce the other 3 panelists. Our first panelist, who again will be presented in a recorded interview, is Orachos Napasintuwong. It is now 3:30 in the morning where she is in Bangkok. That's why she's not with us live. She is Associate Professor and Deputy Department Head of International Affairs in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at Gesetsart University in Bangkok, Thailand. She has served as an editor for Applied Economics Journal and the Asian Journal of Agriculture and Development. She's a board member of the Agricultural Economic Society of Thailand and an executive committee member of the Asia Pacific Agricultural Policy Forum, where David Ortega and I will be in November, and Ora is actually organizing it this year. He's been a very, very close collaborator with us in Southeast Asia under PRCI. Again, PRCI is the Innovation Lab, focused on food security policy research, building capacity and influence, right? And she's coordinating 2 regional studies and really in Southeast Asia and really building out a locally owned, we think, regional network for doing this. So I'm going to ask Austin to put up the video of that, and then I will come back. I'll introduce our other 3 panelists, and we'll go into some questions. Thanks.
So what make good relationships or partnership is that first you have to have shared goals, shared vision. So if you have a shared vision or shared goal, you are working towards the same goal and you're going in the same direction. 2 other factors I think are very, very important. First is trust, and the second is respect. Right? So you trust the partners, you know that we are going towards the same thing. And anytime when you have issues and challenges, you can work collaboratively to solve the problems and issues. You have to respect your partners. You know that they can make decisions. You know that they are authorized to do things. Not just that MSU gave local partners to do things and make decisions and make it localized, but at the same time, we have to trust MSU and make sure that you make the right decision for us at the bigger picture. So those are some of the things that I think would make good partnership. Yeah, we have been working with MSU, particularly on food security or PRCI work, only in the past 5 years. Basically, we didn't understand the same vision we thought we had. At this moment, especially that we continue into the next phase of PRCI, I think we understand it better. We share actually a lot of experience together, and we now do have shared goals, right? And that makes it a lot easier. What is unique is that we do have a lot of collaborations with the partners in this region in Southeast Asia. But when we start working with MSU, especially on capacity building and policy influence, we kind of expanded our scope of work and understanding of how important research can contribute to, policy and also help in the, development as a bigger picture than just doing research and teaching. So this makes it unique in a way that there are things that we have not done. We focused before on just teaching and maybe research, but MSU kind of broadened our perspective in terms of applying the research into policy process. So what's different is that KU might be experienced and skilled and knowledgeable about Southeast Asia, and the partnership that we do with institutions like MSU outside of the region is to bring in some of the resources, financial resources, human resources, skills, technical experience, everything that comes in as a whole package to help us understand better about the whole process of development. So that is something I think is unique about MSU and KU partnership on food security. Most of the activities in other networks were not designed by us. It was kind of designed by other bigger institutions. What I think we have here with MSU, especially through PRCI or Food Security Group, is that we can design our own activities and we can develop the whole program together. Once we establish a shared goal, then everything surrounding activities, contributions, and all other partnerships related to this can be built upon what we discussed at the beginning. So I think the unique part is that we have to start everything together since the beginning. It's not like you have something in mind and come to us to just participate. I think the best part is to build this together. And I'm trying to do that with our partners in Southeast Asia through PRCI. It shouldn't be that KU develop this package and ask them to be involved, right? We should start from need assessment, understand what they wanted to do at the same time. I have to also trade off. There are many other things I want to do, but it might not be their interest. So I have to bring all this in, take into account what they're interested in and they're capable of contributing. So far, we have more support from MSU, especially technical support, but to get an impact, good impact, especially regional or global impact, there are many other things that should be taken into account. Financial affairs, for example, legal framework, internationalization. And these are the things that KU itself is not familiar with. Institution. So institutional development is something we have not done enough so far. We might have been able to develop skills of our researcher, but everything surrounding, I think we still have a lot of work to do. But what I think is that our staff at the moment would require some assistance or training to do a better job in building regional or global program. And I think food security is a complex issue. If you want to address this properly and make real impacts, I think we should bring in people from various major disciplines on our campus, different campuses, or even cross universities in Thailand or in the region, or even people that MSU already partnership. So skills, would need to be developed towards food security, we might be able to use some of the experience and even networks that MSU has to kind of build this package on food security. And I'm sure that KU has a lot to offer, especially in Southeast Asia. I'm pretty sure that we are one of the best who knows well about food science, agronomy, forestry, marine management, all these key knowledge on agriculture and related science. KU is one of the best in the region. So with this, I think MSU would provide us with perspective how to build food security group, and I hope that we can do the same here at KU.
Okay, great. Austin, can you now spotlight me and Tom and Ayala and Madina? And we'll go into as you're doing that. Yeah, so Ora has been a tremendous collaborator, really leader in Southeast Asia. It's been increasingly gratifying to see how she's building out the relationships that are needed to be built out to kind of build the trust that she talks about, that's crucial to collaboration, right? So these studies, she's bringing together teams from Thailand and Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Philippines, Malaysia, right? Along with another colleague, Ushuk, I won't venture his last name. Some of these Thai names are difficult. Ushuk, her collaborator in Thailand, really bringing together this regional network. And it's really great to see. Okay, we're now going to turn to the rest of and let me just say, it's especially gratifying when she noted that she's trying to work in the way that we've tried to work in PRCI. She's trying to work that way with her local partners, right? In terms of starting with their priorities, what do they think is important, really develop it from the ground up that way. Okay, we have three great panelists here. Madina Guloba is a development economist and senior research fellow at the Economic Policy Research Center in Kampala, Uganda. She's a member of the National Advisory Committee on Monitoring and Evaluation in the Office of the Prime Minister of Uganda. She's a member of the National SDG Sustainable Development Goals Task Force. She's a technical member of the Green Growth Strategy, technical committee member of the Northern Uganda Social Action Fund, and technical committee member of the National Population Council. She's also a board member for the Platform for Street Vendors in Uganda. So a very, very diverse and very applied and very engaged kind of involvement that Madina has. She's also been a key player in the intensive research and policy engagement on the sugarcane sector that EPRC has done under PRCI. Tom Jayne is University Foundation Professor Emeritus of Agricultural Economics at Michigan State. Before this, he had professorships at the I'm sorry, sorry, Tom, I have the wrong information here. Tom is a University Foundation professor. You all know him. He's done groundbreaking research on input systems, as Matin referred to. Groundbreaking research on kind of the rise of medium-scale farms in Africa with colleagues, and with colleagues in Africa and other colleagues at MSU, Tom has been very closely involved in the foundation and then ongoing engagement with RENAPRI, the Regional Network of Agricultural Policy Research Institutes, which is now the Africa-wide network of agricultural policy research institutes. He was very even involved in the founding and then nurturing of IAPRI, a policy research institute in Zambia, and finally in Malawi with Mwapata, right? So Tom brings obviously the research background, but also a very intensive, very productive partnering background to his work. Ayala Wineman is assistant professor in our department, our AFRI department. She's also the research coordinator at the Global Child Nutrition Foundation. So she splits her time between MSU and the Global Child Nutrition Foundation. Ayala is currently active in research in Nigeria, in Tanzania with MSU, and in other countries. She's worked in Malawi and a number of other countries of Africa, and I'm sure beyond Africa with her work with the Global Child Nutrition Foundation. Her research relates broadly to rural development and food security, focusing on food system transformation, nutrition, and agricultural land markets. I would qualify Ayala as an out-of-the-box thinker. She likes to ask difficult questions. She thinks a lot about kind of the ethics of partnering and collaboration and research, and I think she'll bring some great insight to this discussion as well. Okay, so I'm going to start with Madina. Madina, you've played a major role in EPRC's collaboration with MSU and with IFPRI. To note that this collaboration is also with IFPRI, and IFPRI researchers were involved in this as well under PRCI. Do you see anything new or unique about the way that PRCI has gone about structuring our partnerships? And what has been especially helpful, or what has been not so helpful about the way that we have gone about this? Madina.
Thank you, Dave. I hope you can hear me very well, because
yes, we can hear you well.
Yeah, so if I veer off, you just know I'm a bit dozing, but this is too interesting to do.
It is late, yes.
So ideally, this partnership created a bit of awareness within ourselves, because as Orachos did indicate, it allowed the co-creation process to mature, when EPRC expressed interest to do this work, to be the leading food and nutrition security center, of course, I believe the PRCI secretariat bought into the idea, because that's what was the vision for the EPRC. So when we submitted our proposals, we thought, as usual, most funders, they fund what you have actually submitted, and then they monitor that process. But ideally here, this was different. When we did submit our proposal, here comes Dave with the team, and they're like, okay, you submitted this, but we do have some experts from IFPRI and even MSU who can support to co-create this to the level you might want to see it better for action. So that's how we went into this, and it has been unique in a way that it has been different, that when you submit a proposal, then you sit through a whole period of co-creation, and rather than micromanagement of processes as you submitted, that you own up, that even those who are going to support in terms of monitoring also understand exactly what you're doing. So it has been that element of relationships that have been pretty awesome, I must say that. And then ideally also the element of the platform for the mentoring process that is beyond even, as I keep saying, I'm an old geezer in this business. So I usually think maybe there's nothing for me to learn more. And then I come here with a new mindset that I think there's something for me to learn, because this is something new. And these are new people with new analytical fields, because they're coming from the university. Then there is the international element from IFPRI. So that open-mindedness really opened this old person to learn. And I really like the collaboration and the mentorship that came on board as we went along, David. So that has been something that as EPRC and myself, we have found unique in this process of engagement, and the marriage we had with MSU being successful. And we hope this marriage doesn't die.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Madina. That's great. No, I mean, we value long-term, as we said from the beginning, long-term engagements, long-term relationships, and we absolutely don't want this to die. PRCI will end in a little less than 2 years, but we absolutely want to find additional ways to continue to collaborate. So thank you for that contribution. You've been a great partner. EPRC has been a really, really great partner. It's been a lot of fun. That's one of the things I've learned, is that when we work this way, you do impactful work, you do good work, and it's a heck of a lot more fun, in my view, to do it that way. Okay, we might be able to have a couple rounds with people here. I'm going to come to Tom now. So Tom, as I alluded to in my introduction of you, together with African partners and other MSU colleagues, you played a major role in the creation of IAPRI in Zambia, MOPAT in Malawi, RENAPRI in Eastern Southern Africa, and now Africa-wide. And you've continued to be closely engaged with these organizations over time. And I would say This has gone on for what, 25 years, right? It's gone on for quite a while. So if Madina's an old geezer, you and I are really old geezers, right? And so you've got some perspective here. So my question is, what are some of the lessons that you have learned about what we, as partners in a major Western organization, can and should do, and what we should not do to promote African institutional development in this area?
Great. Okay. Well, thank you for that question. So I'll just cut to the chase. I think that there are two things that the Food Security Group and everyone else should probably be paying more attention to. Let me say first that I think Food Security Group does this in organizational capacity building better than most international organizations. But I've kind of come to the conclusion that there are two big issues that we need to deal with more. The first one is to make the distinction between individual capacity strengthening and organizational capacity strengthening. And most international programs working on capacity development really are working on building the capacity of individuals, like the STARS program and things like that. But what tends to happen if you work only on individual capacity building without strengthening the organization and its structures is that the best talent ends up getting bid away to the World Bank or to IFPRI or to, the FAO so you're making these investments in individual capacity that you think are going to go back and strengthen the institution. But if the institution itself is not strong enough, you tend to lose a lot of people. And so it's kind of like pushing a huge boulder uphill and hoping that you're going to, continue to make progress. So, this begs the question then: what do I mean by organizational capacity development, and what can a group like PRCI, FSG more broadly, what can we do to help African organizations strengthen their capacity? And I have a slide that I would like to take a moment to go into. Let me just, before I do that though, because that kind of gets into the weeds, let me go to the second point where I think MSU needs to focus more, and that is on the ecosystem, the importance of the ecosystem and making it more hospitable for African research organizations to thrive. So, if you look at the ecosystem, it's very crowded. And in the last 15 years or so, you see foundations and some donors investing in and creating new development organizations that overlap the mandate of these nationally recognized agricultural research institutions that we're trying to promote in the ecosystem. And so there's a clash and an overlapping agenda. Usually the foundations can put a lot more money into their newly created organizations, like AGRA, like the Tony Blair Institute. I don't want to, point fingers too much, but just for the sake of clarity, these are the groups that I'm talking about. And they have a lot of money, and they can nominally, buy the support of organizations like the one Madina and Tegemeo and the ones that we're trying to promote. And they bring them in as marginal partners and say, well, we're helping to build their capacity. We're helping to, we're partnering with them, but they really have no real, voice in this process. And, I have to wonder what the motives are of the organizations that are putting, $40 million behind a huge entity that, has the potential to really swamp and overwhelm and draw capacity out of the national agricultural research and extension and policy system. So we know that in AGRA, for example, there are hundreds of well-trained African ag economists and other scientists who have been drawn from the ranks of the national institutes that we're trying to strengthen. So there really is that when I talk about the ecosystem, I kind of think of the analogy of a pine tree that drops needles on the ground, and it sort of is meant to depress growth of competing organisms around it. And there, to some extent, there is that ecosystem issue that we must confront if we're going to be serious about promoting the development of, bona fide, recognized African research organizations. Now, let me just take one on the share screen. Can you see my slide here?
Yes, we can. It's not in slideshow mode, but we can see it.
Let me do that. Okay, so so in terms of institutional capacity, there are these elements of it: core funding, externally facing, and internally facing management. And
we're not seeing the figure yet.
Okay,
just the title.
Okay, I'll just talk it through.
Okay.
In terms of core support, I think the questions to ask is, does an institution have at least 4 or 5 years of funding that would enable them to go out and make hires, attract and retain staff that they, would want to make a commitment to for, at least 4 or 5 years? If you can't do that, it's really difficult to convince some of the, Africa's best talent to come back to their country and commit themselves to a 1-year or a 2-year contract to work in an organization. So it's a very difficult thing to do. So, core funding also makes it possible to develop a governance structure, to have, a high quality board of directors that can guide the organization, all of those kind of things that may sound kind of like nitty-gritty details, but they're absolutely crucial to developing strong organizations that can attract and retain qualified, African analysts to build these organizations. So let me just cut to the chase. It's not just about individual capacity development. We really need to focus on the things that will strengthen an organization and make it attractive for people to want to come and really make a professional career at that organization. I'll stop there.
Great. Thanks, Tom. A hard-hitting critique, but I think a well-placed critique. I think many of us have been trying to make this point in global fora. But I think, just like we used to say, you need to find different ways of saying some of the same things to policymakers over and over and over, right? For some of it to be understood, right? We've got to keep saying this over and over and over to the major international donors, and we need to do it in collaboration, as we're doing with our local partners, right? So that's excellent, very, very, very fundamental thing about how we move forward to have maximum impact. Okay, let me come to Ayala. So Ayala, you've done some thinking about what happens at what you call the far end of the spectrum of co-creation, right? And you've asked the question, how can grantees balance their responsibilities to funders, so the USAIDs and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the other foundations and so forth of the world, the other bilateral donors, balance their responsibilities to funders with the risk that may be found at the far end of the spectrum of co-creation. So, can you explain what you mean by this far end of the spectrum of co-creation, and whether you think it should always be the objective in partnerships? Tough questions, but I think those are the kinds of questions you like.
Thanks for the question. Thanks for having me here. And I want to start by saying, just expressing how inspired I am by the food security group in general. So your question was about what I think of as a spectrum of co-creation. So I'll take just a minute to describe what I understand to be that spectrum, acknowledging that other people here probably have also different views. So this is just my understanding. On one end of a spectrum, there is sort of an outdated way of doing things. I'll describe this in an exaggerated way, and it's not how any of us operate in reality, but it's where research on development in the global South is undertaken primarily by researchers in or from or based in the global North without the incorporation of voices from the global South. And to the extent that there is partnership, it takes the form of in-country partners serving as data collectors. The middle of the spectrum of co-creation, as I understand it, is where most of us reside most of the time. In the middle of the spectrum, partnership is valued, and so research is undertaken collaboratively with both researchers from the global North and South. There are efforts to incorporate local voices into the research enterprises. Capacity building is central in the middle of the co-creation spectrum, I think. And yet, within partnerships, there remains very different levels of power within the relationship that continues to persist to this day. And while capacity building is valued, it's also conceived as something that's one-directional. So partners from the global North are strengthening or building capacities of their partners in the global South. So there are achievements in the middle of the spectrum, and there are also challenges. What I understand to be the far end of the spectrum of co-creation, and I want to say that like the food security group, I think tends to be, further along this spectrum than many others, and I really applaud that. At the far end of the spectrum, research is undertaken in co-equal partnership between researchers in the global North and South. Both partners share ownership of the research enterprise equally, and that includes setting the agenda from the very start. And to the extent that a project requires a lead, which is often necessary in organizational structure, partners trade off leadership. And that means that half the time, partners from the global North are in a subordinate role in the partnership. So you asked whether the far end of the spectrum of co-creation is what we should be aiming for always. And my perspective is yes, I do think that we should be deliberately and constantly aiming for the far end of this spectrum, as I understand it. I also acknowledge and observe that there can be tension between the short-term and long-term goals in research partnerships. In the short term, there's an imperative to produce something that seems excellent right away. Still, I want to make the case that the value of a research project is equally about the process as about the product. So noting that, I think, yes, my answer is yes, we should be aiming for that far end of the spectrum.
Great, thank you, Ayala. Yes, I would tie this back to what I would agree with you. I think it's a process to get there. It's difficult, right? Difficult for personal human reasons and difficult for institutional reasons, right? Monetary reasons, etc. But I think the reason we need to go there is what I was saying before about the very simple fact that the only people that can change a system are the people in that system, right? It's the farmers, it's the traders, etc. It's the firms, the enterprises in these food systems that we're working with. It's the policymakers in government. They have to internalize, they have to be able to ask the questions that are important to them, because it's the only way that they can work with others and work their way in a very messy way, as it always is, towards some kind of reasonable design of policies and programs that can actually be implemented, on the ground. So I think we in the West have so much to learn in this way. But I would also say that, for example, an EPRC or a Gesetzart University or our other partners, being research-oriented partners, also need to realize this and internalize this. they need to step down and work with the local, the ones who really are making the change, right? Anyway, let me get off my soapbox and turn back to our panelists. Okay, we have about 15 more minutes. Madina, what are two pieces of advice that you would give both to MSU and to EPRC, thinking about the experience over the past 5 years, right? What two pieces of advice would you give both to MSU and to EPRC, yourself and your own leadership within EPRC, to ensure strengthened partnerships going forward?
Thank you, Dave. I think also just to stress what Ayala had said, I think partly we should not be seen also in the South as just waiting to take what is coming. We need to also be bold enough, because it has to come also from within, that you need to take a bold step to say, I can do this. And this is where you stop, this is where you stop. And I think that's where we have come from a long way. And partly that's why EPRC is in place. Because ideally, I think World Bank used to do a lot of work. And then us, we are like the research assistants, as you've said. But government took a bold move to say we are setting out our own think tank with our local participants to advise on local issues for local uptake. So I think that's one of the things that I think most local institutions and governance structures have to be bold enough to do, such that ideally, of course, if you let yourself be the rat in there, then of course the cat will come and eat you up if you don't strengthen up your traps. So that's what I can say there. So it has to be bold on both sides, such that you don't be just a taker, but also be coming on the convening table as also a partner. So now, going back to what Dave had indicated, so what can we do in terms of this, in terms of the leadership, taking it forward? So one of the key issues, at least as EPRS, we can recognize, we are a think tank. We've been thinking in terms of policy spaces, knowledge brokering. And ideally, I'll be honest, the way policy thinks is totally different. And when we approached with David, I think at that time we did argue for some time that our policymakers are not interested in the actual analytical frameworks that we are probably looking out for. So we would do it in the other way end. We have to satisfy the local need from the policy side, but also looking out from the end that David had also approached it in terms of the rigor. So I would take it in this way, that both EPRC and MSU need to look at the leveraging on the capacities of both institutions. We are local and we know the policy. They are international, but they also know the analytical rigor in terms of academia, in terms of new issues coming on board. So these are some of the two issues from both leadership ends that we can leverage on, ideally going forward. That in terms of the way we look out for it, we're not going to look at MSU as just the engine for resource funding, but we're looking at an issue of coming in terms of how best we craft this, that we have a win-win situation where I don't know if it's correct to say milking your brains for our own good, for making sure we ensure that our political and policy guidance for evidence is really actualized in the way that we want to see. So these partnerships will ensure that we leverage on each other's strengths as for us locals, and then leveraging on your strengths in terms of the field of the analytics to ensure that you're on board and you're also up to date with what you're doing. So David, we need to continue joint mentorships. I know we can learn from one another in terms of the ways of how we broker knowledge in here. And I know the way the US government in terms of its policy, I know you're also trying to do differently in terms of trying to remain relevant, the same way we try to remain relevant within the policy systems that keep changing, because the dynamics of the external environment also affect the way we do our work as we go forward as EPRC, and also, of course, as think tanks around the globe.
Excellent. Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Madina. Yes, we've got challenges on both sides. And I think, as you noted, you will have noted in Aura's video as well, it takes some time to work these relationships out. She basically said for the first few years, we didn't really have the same vision. We weren't really sure about what we were both doing. But now, working at it, we do have a common vision. We are working together. It's going in the right direction. Well, you know, it takes time to do that. So length of run and a willingness both by the Western organization, by the African and Asian organizations, and in this world where nothing gets done without money, the donor organizations being willing to go long-term on this kind of thing is just so crucial. Okay, let me come to Tom. We've got 12 more minutes. And then another question to Ayala, and then kind of wrap up questions like Saweda did. So Tom, you addressed a lot in your first response without using the word localization. I think you spoke to that a lot. So my question for you, you can go into that more if you would like, but my question to you is, can you comment on if and how your views on these issues have changed or at least evolved over time, right? These issues of institutional capacity strengthening and how to really get impact on the ground.
Right. Thank you, Dave. So certainly if impact is one of the primary goals of our activities, I think that more and more people are increasingly convinced that you have to do that with local partners on the ground, and that they should ideally be leading that process. And I increasingly hear and policymakers just by the points they make, they would prefer to hear guidance from trusted people who live in that country and have lived there for a long time. They know the political and the social realities of the place. And there's just a certain level of trust that's required that you don't get from international experts who, kind of might be there for 2 years and then they go. So I really think there's no substitute for partnering and strengthening those organizations, which I think is what the localization moniker is about. So maybe what I've learned over the past 10 years is what works and what doesn't work, and what works very slowly and what might work more quickly. And as I said in my first round, I feel like there's almost Leontief technology with individual and institutional capacity development. You can train individuals, all the time, but you will lose most of them to an organization that pays bigger salaries and offers more. So you've got to also be able to strengthen the organization itself to make it an attractive home for these people whose capacity are being strengthened. And that gets into all these nitty-gritty aspects of organizational management. And so without repeating myself, I just say that I think those are the things that we need to work on, as well as the ecosystem, and maybe convincing some donors that you can create new organizations if you want to, but sooner or later, if you want to scale on the ground, you're going to need to deal with strong national partners. Yeah. And so we had better start investing in strong national partners. And getting some of the major foundations to think along those lines may be one of the most important contributions that could be made over the long term to developing strong, I would say NARI, strong national agricultural research and extension systems, and include policy analysis within the NARIs. It's a part of the research system. Yeah.
Right. Great. Thank you, Tom. Thanks very much. A very simple analytical observation, which I think nobody can disagree with. An individual's productivity is heavily influenced by the institutional environment they're operating in, right? Thus, if we want to actually take advantage of all the investments we've made in individual capacity building, we must invest in with our partners starting with them and their definition of needs in institutional capacity strengthening.
Yeah.
Let me go to Ayala, and then we'll have a final round of final words from our wise panel. So mutual accountability is one of those, it can be one of those dry bureaucratic terms. At least at one point, it seemed like a dry bureaucratic term to me. But in fact, it's central to partnerships, right? Central to functioning partnerships. And it implies responsibilities on both sides. It can be very difficult to discuss openly and to workably put into practice. How do you think about this issue in your own partnerships, and what do you suggest as practical approaches to improving mutual accountability?
I can share two thoughts. These are not big thoughts, but just sort of very observations in my very small slice of the world. You ask, what do I suggest? So first of all, the foundation of a good partnership is good communication. How do you get good communication? Within our partnerships, within our teams, we want to set a tone in the group that's warm, because a warm temperature will loosen the flow of communication. And that's what makes it possible to discuss difficult topics without falling back on defensiveness. So I guess I suggest leading with warmth and having faith that what flows from that will be something good. That's one suggestion. Another suggestion I have is that a requisite of mutual accountability is the maximum feeling of co-ownership in the project that we can generate. So when people feel and recognize themselves accurately as being co-owners, they're much more likely to independently, by their own motor, show up with good work in both quantity and quality. And when people, conversely, when people detect that they are only co-owners on paper, but not in reality, you're much more likely to have to cajole and coax and nag and oversee and check the quality of your partner's work. That's been my experience. Others may have a different experience, but in general, as a practical approach, I'd encourage us, myself included, to aim in our partnerships for less hierarchy and more genuine co-ownership.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Ayala. So just really getting at the human dimensions of all of this, because in the end, these are human beings collaborating, and ideally or necessarily towards a common goal where they all feel valued, and you're going to have a much more productive effort when you do that. So, we need high-level investment. We need really, I would say, major, as Tom has said, rethinking of where the investment is going. We need to continue to build up a focus on institutional capacity strengthening. Ora said that we haven't done a lot of that in Thailand, right? And she's right that we've done more of it in PRCI in Africa than we have in Asia. I think it took us a little while learning our way into and with the partners in Asia, right? But we see kind of the same demand and the same desire for this kind of thing in Asia that we see in Africa. So, okay, we have 4 minutes. Let's go back to Madina, then Tom, then Ayala. Any parting thoughts here before we wrap this great session up?
Thanks. I think this has been great because ideally it's because of the platform for exchange. I think sooner or later, I think PRCI realized that when they put the Africa group and the Asia group together, the cross-learning that happened, they realized they're missing out on something that we in the African side were really having. I think that platform and community of practice created the issue that we also created demand for certain aspects that I think we are missing, and also created demand for issues like what he's talking about, the trainings, which I think under the model had been overlooked for the Asian side. So I like this element of community of practice that has been created, and ideally it has to be something that has to be demand driven and more so less than supply driven, you know what I mean? So we need to create this element of that. Now we have cross-learning that's coming across the board on all the CPLs, which is happening now better than before. I must tell you, Dave, now I'm receiving papers review from all there from Nigeria and Senegal because of this element of collaborations that this engagement has created. And I think it's a good move for both sides. And ideally, now we are coming on board as partners. Now we are also co-creating in terms of trainings. In the next phases, as partners, we're coming now to create the agenda together with PRCI and MSU to make sure we have demand-driven trainings that are also being led by the institutions, the centers, the labs that were created at the beginning. And this is continuity and sustainability. And this is critical for any partnerships, as Ayala had said, and John and Tom, that these are some of the things that we do not see most often happening in most of the partnerships we normally see. It's usually micromanagement, top, bottom, and that's it. And then we execute, you actually being laissez-faire, say, when are they finishing? And then that's closed. So this is something I'm seeing being different in the way we have approached this whole partnership with MSU under the lab. Kudos to the team, at least.
Thanks so much, Madina. Yeah, we really appreciate it. Tom, 30 seconds, 1 minute.
Okay, all right. I will just make two parting remarks. And the first one builds on what Madina mentioned, that I also applaud MSU and PRCI. There's just a lot of committed individuals on that team that really, they care about building capacity on the ground. And I still work, even as an emeritus professor with Bill Burke and Milu Moyanga in Malawi. And, I'm just really impressed by their dedication to the cause. The second point I would make is that I think it would help to kind of just put yourself in the position of somebody in the board of directors of one of these national institutes, and think about the constraints that and the challenges that they're facing about getting their institution moving. And, I think that just would be a very good thought experiment to sort of figure out what their needs are that go beyond individual strengthening, and how PRCI could perhaps support them in finding win-win opportunities between MSU and the interests of the Institute. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks so much. Ayala.
Last thought is that thank you for this conversation. My parting thought is that I think we need to create more space for open conversation, spaces that are non-judgmental and allow us to be vulnerable and introspective about how we do our work. So thanks for this conversation. I think we need to carve out more spaces. The reality of the research funding world is that people feel like they have to be constantly marketing themselves, which is the opposite of being vulnerable. But I think we need spaces where we can be vulnerable together.
Yeah, great way to end this. Thank you, Ayala. So I am going to wrap this up. I'm going to be very brief. I'm basically going to thank everyone. I want to thank all the keynote speakers, Eric for starting us off, Matin, Derek, Jeff Bloem, thank you so much. The four members of each panel, fantastic panels, really, really good discussions. I'm biased, but I think these are some of the best discussions I've seen on an online forum in a long time. I want to thank everybody who participated, those who stayed as long as they could and couldn't stay to the end, and those of you that have stayed to the end. And then I would like to thank very much the people that this would not have been possible without. Levy Randolph, AFRI communications specialist, so much work behind the scenes. Austin Witt, FSG communications specialist, was communicating with him at 10 o'clock last night to get some things, sorted out. MyWish was doing the same. MyWish has been behind the scenes, but doing a tremendous amount of work. Megan Seidel, who's not in AFRI, but really tremendous amount of work kind of helping us pull this whole thing together. So as always, it's a team effort. We think it's been super worthwhile. We look forward to doing something like this again, ideally with more of us in person. So everybody have a good evening, a good short night for some of you if you're across the Atlantic, and we'll talk again. Thank you.
Okay.